300 calories a day. Not a diet. Not a mistake. A sentence. Imagine waking up already starving, your body hollow, your hands shaking, your thoughts no longer your own. Imagine knowing that no matter how carefully you ration, no matter how slowly you chew, today will still end in hunger. And tomorrow will be worse. Inside the Jewish ghettos of Nazi-occupied Europe, hunger was not a side effect of war. It was the weapon, carefully measured, coldly calculated, a daily allowance designed not to sustain life, but to drain it away one heartbeat at a time. Children learned to count calories before they learned to read. Mothers broke bread into crumbs and pretended they had already eaten. Fathers traded the last family heirlooms for a sack of potatoes that might keep everyone alive for one more week. Bodies grew thinner, streets grew quieter, and death stopped looking sudden. It became routine. This is not a story about camps or gas chambers. This is the story of what happened before, of how millions were slowly starved behind walls while the world watched, of how survival itself became an act of resistance. And once you understand what 300 calories really means, you will never forget it. Chapter 1. Before the walls closed. On a quiet morning in Warsaw, long before the walls went up, a boy runs through a narrow street with a warm loaf pressed against his chest, the crust cracking under his fingers, the smell of fresh bread trailing behind him like a promise. He does not know yet that this simple act, carrying bread home, will one day become impossible, punishable, deadly. For now, the city is alive. The danger is invisible. History has not arrived at the doorstep yet. Before the German invasion, Jewish life across Poland and Eastern Europe moved to a rhythm shaped by work, faith, and food. It was not an easy life, but it was a complete one. Days began early. Shopkeepers lifted metal shutters as the sky lightened. Tailors leaned over wooden tables worn smooth by generations of hands. Market stalls filled the air with noise, vendors shouting prices, carts rattling over cobblestones, chickens flapping in crates. There was the sharp smell of pickled vegetables, the sweetness of baked challah, the heavy scent of herring packed in barrels of brine. Hunger existed, yes, but it was familiar, temporary, something that could be answered with effort, ingenuity, or help from a neighbor. In cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow, Jewish neighborhoods were dense with life. Children spilled into courtyards after school, their voices echoing between brick walls. Mothers leaned out of windows to call them home for supper. The smell of soup drifted from open doors, potatoes, onions, a bit of barley when money allowed. Meals were modest, often stretched thin, but they were shared. Food was not just fuel. It was continuity. It was memory passed from one generation to the next. Friday afternoons carried a different feeling entirely. The streets grew calmer as shops closed early. Inside cramped apartments, tables were scrubbed clean, candlesticks polished, bread braided by hand. Even in homes where money was scarce, something special was prepared. A little extra flour saved during the week. A chicken divided carefully, so everyone received a portion. The sound of prayers floated through open windows as evening approached, blending with the distant bells of churches and the clatter of trams. In those moments, dignity was not something abstract. It was something you could touch, something you could taste. Work defined survival long before the ghettos did. Jewish laborers filled factories, workshops, and warehouses. Seamstresses stitched until their fingers cramped. Shoemakers inhaled the sharp sting of leather and glue from dawn until dusk. Porters hauled sacks of grain and crates of goods through railway yards, their backs bent but unbroken. Wages were low. Anti-Semitism limited opportunity. But work meant bread on the table. It meant a reason to wake up. It meant the quiet pride of providing, even when the margins were thin. Markets were the heartbeat of these communities. Early each morning, women inspected vegetables with practiced eyes, weighing each purchase against the coins in their pockets. A cabbage might be split between two families. A handful of carrots stretched across several meals. Bargaining was an art form, sharpened by necessity. Laughter still found its way into these exchanges, quick and defiant, as if humor itself were a form of protection against a hard world. Synagogues were more than places of worship. They were gathering points, schools, shelters from loneliness. Wooden benches polished by decades of use creaked under the weight of men wrapped in prayer shawls. The air smelled of wax and old books. Voices rose and fell together, steady and reassuring. In these spaces, people felt anchored to tradition, to each other, to something larger than the daily struggle. Children learned early how the world worked. They understood the value of a coin, the importance of finishing every bite on their plate. But they also knew play. They chased one another through alleyways, scraped knees forgotten by evening. They memorized songs, recited lessons, dreamed of futures that felt reachable. Parents argued over homework, worried about apprenticeships, planned weddings. Life pressed forward, imperfect but intact. Even in poverty, there was structure. Even in hardship, there was choice. You could decide how to spend your last coins. You could choose to skip a meal so your child could eat more. You could trade, borrow, improvise. Hunger was not yet absolute. It had edges. It had solutions. And then, in September of 1939, the sound changed. Air raid sirens tore through the morning. The ground shook. Windows shattered. The sky filled with smoke. German forces crossed the border, and within weeks, Poland collapsed under the weight of occupation. At first, life continued in fragments. Shops reopened. Markets reassembled, smaller now, more cautious. People told themselves that this, too, would pass. That wars ended. That families endured. But the rules began to shift. Jewish businesses were marked, then seized. Bank accounts frozen. Radios confiscated. Curfews imposed. Food became harder to find. Prices climbed. Fear seeped into every transaction. The streets felt narrower. The air heavier. Still, even then, few could imagine what was coming. Because what was about to be taken was not only freedom of movement or safety for violence. It was something more intimate, more devastating. It was the ordinary act of living, the ability to shop, to cook, to share a meal without fear, the dignity of choosing what went into your body and when. Before the walls closed, people still believed in tomorrow. They still planned meals, birthdays, holidays. They still measure hardship in weeks and months, not in calories. They did not yet know that food itself would soon become a weapon, counted and controlled, reduced to numbers that could not sustain life. They did not know that the smells of bread and soup would soon be replaced by the stench of rot and sickness. That markets would vanish. That kitchens would fall silent. That hunger would no longer come and go, but would settle in, permanent and precise. For now, the walls were not built. The streets were still open. And because of that, the danger felt distant, almost unreal. But it was already moving closer, one decree at a time. Chapter 2. Conquest and Decree. The first signs came quietly, almost politely, written in ink before they were enforced with guns. A notice pasted to a wall. An order read aloud in a trembling voice. A rule that sounded temporary, reasonable, almost bureaucratic. By the time people realized what these decrees truly meant, the ground beneath their lives had already shifted. In the days after the invasion, the streets were still familiar, but something in the air had changed. Soldiers marched where children once played. Boots struck pavement with mechanical precision, a sound that did not belong to the city. Shopkeepers watched from behind their counters as uniforms passed by windows, rifles slung casually, as if violence were simply another tool. The war had arrived, but its full shape had not yet revealed itself. At first, the new authorities spoke the language of order. Registration, identification, compliance. Jewish residents were required to report to offices they had never entered before, filling out forms that demanded names, ages, professions, addresses, family members. Lines stretched for hours. People stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to the shuffle of papers and the scratch of pens, the smell of sweat and fear mingling in cramped hallways. No one explained why this information was needed. They were told it was for security, for efficiency, for their own good. Then came the armbands. White cloth, a blue star, worn on the sleeve, visible at all times, a mark that could not be hidden. The first morning people stepped outside wearing them. The city seemed to stare back. Neighbors looked away. Some whispered apologies. Others watched with open curiosity. A few smiled. The fabric itself weighed almost nothing, but it changed everything. It told soldiers exactly who could be stopped, searched, beaten. It told shopkeepers who could be refused service. It told the world who no longer belonged. Food was the next thing to change. Markets still existed, but they were no longer neutral spaces. Jewish customers were pushed to the back, told to wait until others were served. Prices doubled, then tripled. Items vanished without explanation. Butter disappeared first, then meat, then eggs. What remained was often bruised, spoiled, or rationed so strictly that it barely counted as nourishment. People learned to cook with less, then with almost nothing. They boiled peels. They saved crumbs. They stretched meals into shadows of what they once were. Curfews followed. Streets that had once buzzed late into the evening fell silent after dark. Windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. Anyone caught outside risked arrest or worse. Hunger grew sharper at night, when sleep came harder and thoughts circled endlessly around food. The body remembered routines, even as the world erased them. Confiscations began under the guise of necessity. Radios were taken, so no one could listen to foreign broadcasts. Bicycles were seized, then typewriters, then businesses. Jewish-owned shops were ordered to close or handed over to new management overnight. Signs were ripped down. Inventory disappeared. Men who had worked the same trade for decades suddenly had nowhere to go in the morning. Work, once a lifeline, became a trap. Forced labor orders arrived without warning. Men were rounded up on street corners, pulled from apartments, dragged out of synagogues. They were sent to clean streets, repair roads, haul debris, often without pay, sometimes without food. The work was deliberately exhausting, designed to break bodies already weakened by stress and hunger. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who resisted vanished. Women took on impossible burdens. They searched for food while dodging patrols. They stood in lines that led nowhere. They sold clothing, furniture, wedding rings, anything that could be exchanged for a few potatoes or a loaf of bread. Apartments grew emptier as possessions vanished, replaced by the constant calculation of survival. Children noticed everything. They noticed the way adults spoke more quietly, the way laughter sounded forced, the way meals grew smaller and smaller. They noticed when fathers did not come home, when teachers disappeared, when schoolbooks were replaced by silence. Childhood began to shrink, compressed by fear and hunger. The decrees multiplied. Jews were barred from parks, from public transportation, from certain streets, from entire neighborhoods. Each restriction tightened the boundaries of daily life, shrinking the world inch by inch. People learned new routes through the city, paths that avoided danger but took longer, demanded more energy, burned more calories their bodies could not spare. Food rationing became official policy. Non-Jewish residents received cards that allowed them access to bread, sugar, fats. Jewish ration cards, when issued at all, listed quantities so small they bordered on mockery. Flour measured in grams. Fat reduced to almost nothing. The numbers looked technical, precise, neutral, but behind them was intent. These rations were not designed to sustain life. They were designed to exhaust it. Doctors began to see the effects immediately. Weight loss accelerated. Infections lingered. Wounds refused to heal. People complained of dizziness, weakness, constant cold, even in warm rooms. Hunger was no longer occasional. It was permanent. It followed people through every hour of the day, gnawing at the edges of thought. Fear became routine. Raids erupted without warning. Soldiers burst into apartments at dawn, overturning cupboards, ripping apart mattresses, searching for hidden food, hidden radios, hidden people. A sack of flour could mean prison. A piece of meat could mean death. Families learned to hide what little they had in walls, under floors, inside clothing. The stress of concealment became its own form of starvation. Public humiliation was encouraged. Men were forced to scrub sidewalks with bare hands while crowds watched. Women were slapped in the street for stepping out of line. Children were mocked, shoved, sometimes beaten for sport. These acts were not random. They were demonstrations, lessons meant to teach submission, to erode dignity before physical destruction began. Still, many believed this was the worst it would get. They told themselves stories, that the war would end soon, that harsh measures were temporary, that if they followed the rules, stayed quiet, avoided trouble, they would survive. History had taught them endurance. Pogroms had come before. Hard times had passed. Surely this too would pass. But something new was taking shape beneath the surface. The city itself was being reorganized. Streets were surveyed, neighborhoods mapped, barriers planned. Officials spoke in administrative language about relocation and efficiency. No one used the word prison. No one said starvation. The truth was hidden behind procedure. As winter approached, hunger deepened. Coal was scarce. Apartments grew colder. Bodies burned more energy just to stay warm, accelerating weight loss. Soup kitchens appeared, offering watery broth that barely slowed the decline. People lined up for hours, clutching bowls, hoping the pot would not run dry before their turn. The smell of boiling cabbage became both comfort and torment, promising sustenance it could not deliver. Disease crept in quietly, feeding on malnutrition. Coughs lingered. Fever spread. Doctors warned that without adequate food, epidemics were inevitable. Their warnings were ignored. By now, the decrees had reshaped daily existence. Life no longer unfolded naturally. It was negotiated, rationed, restricted. Every decision carried risk. Every movement required calculation. Survival demanded constant vigilance. And then came the orders that changed everything. Relocation notices. Instructions to move into designated areas. Deadlines measured in days. Families given minutes to pack what they could carry. Apartments abandoned. Streets clogged with carts and bundles. The sound of footsteps echoed as thousands moved at once, driven by fear and confusion. Walls were mentioned casually, as if they were formality, a way to organize space, to prevent disease, to maintain order. No one spoke openly about what it would mean to be sealed inside. As people crossed into these designated zones, they brought with them whatever food they could salvage. A sack of flour, a jar of pickles, a few onions wrapped in cloth. They did not know these supplies would soon mean the difference between life and death. They did not know how quickly they would disappear. The world they had known was collapsing, but it had not yet vanished entirely. Markets still existed beyond the boundaries. Bread was still baked somewhere in the city. Life continued, just out of reach. The walls were not yet complete, but the logic behind them was already in place. And once those walls closed, hunger would no longer be a consequence of war. It would become the system itself. Chapter 3: Building the Ghettos. The walls did not rise overnight. They crept forward, quietly at first, measured in paperwork and surveys before they were ever measured in bricks. A line drawn on a map, a boundary described in administrative language. Streets renamed, reassigned, erased. Most people did not realize they were already inside a prison until the exits began to disappear. In the weeks leading up to the sealing of the ghettos, the cities felt unsettled, like a body bracing for impact. Trucks rolled through neighborhoods at dawn. Wooden posts were driven into the ground. Barbed wire appeared along streets that had once led freely to markets, schools, and factories. German officials walked with clipboards, pointing, measuring, nodding. Their movements were calm, professional, as if they were planning drainage systems, not human confinement. Orders arrived, demanding relocation. Entire families were told to move within hours, sometimes minutes. A knock at the door, a shouted command in broken Polish. People scrambled, hands shaking as they decided what could be carried and what would be left behind forever. Clothing was folded hastily. Pots and pans clanged into sacks. Photographs were tucked into pockets. Furniture remained, untouched, as if the owners might return later that afternoon. Stairwells echoed with footsteps. Hallways filled with murmured prayers and the sound of children crying, confused and frightened. Outside, the streets clogged with carts and bundles. Old men leaned on canes. Mothers pulled children by the hand, urging them forward, whispering reassurances they did not believe themselves. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. People were herded into specific districts, areas already overcrowded, even before the influx began. Apartments designed for one family were suddenly home to 3, 4, sometimes more. Rooms filled wall to wall with bodies. Mattresses were shared. Floors became beds. Privacy vanished overnight. The ghettos were not placed randomly. They were carved out of the poorest sections of the cities, areas with crumbling infrastructure and limited access to clean water. Streets were narrow. Buildings were old. Sanitation was already strained. This was not coincidence. It was calculation. As relocation continued, the boundaries tightened. Streets that once connected neighborhoods were blocked. Bridges were closed. Gates were installed at key intersections, guarded by armed sentries. Each day, movement became more restricted. Each night, another opening disappeared. When the walls finally went up, they were blunt and unapologetic. Brick, concrete, wood, barbed wire. In some places, they rose higher than a man could reach. In others, they were topped with broken glass or jagged metal. Windows that once looked out onto the rest of the city were suddenly sealed, bricked over from the outside. Families woke up to find daylight gone, replaced by darkness and damp stone. Inside, the soundscape changed immediately. The hum of the city faded. Trams passed beyond the walls, audible but unreachable. Church bells rang somewhere outside, muffled and distant. Inside the ghetto, new sounds took over: coughing, shouting, crying, the constant shuffle of feet on overcrowded streets. Silence, when it came, was heavy and unnatural. Food supplies dwindled almost at once. People had brought what they could, but it was never enough. Flour sacks emptied quickly. Pickled vegetables spoiled. Bread went stale, then vanished entirely. There were no farms inside the walls. No markets with steady supply lines. Everything that entered the ghetto had to pass through German control, and very little was allowed in. Ration cards were issued, but they were tokens rather than solutions. Lines formed before dawn, winding through streets already choked with people. Men and women waited for hours, clutching bowls, hoping for soup that was thin enough to see the bottom through it. The smell of boiled cabbage drifted through the air, sour and relentless. The density inside the ghettos was suffocating. Tens of thousands were packed into areas never meant to hold them. Bodies pressed together on staircases. Children slept 3 to a bed. Air became stale, thick with smoke from makeshift stoves and the smell of unwashed clothes. In winter, windows stayed shut to keep out the cold. In summer, the heat was unbearable, magnifying the stench of waste and sickness. Disease followed quickly. With clean water scarce and sewage systems overwhelmed, lice spread rapidly. Typhus appeared, then tuberculosis. Doctors warned that malnutrition weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses deadly. Clinics filled with patients who could not be treated properly because there was no medicine, no food to support recovery. The walls were not just physical barriers. They were psychological weapons. From inside, the outside world looked close enough to touch. People could hear conversations beyond the barriers. They could smell bakeries they were forbidden to enter. Sometimes they could see people walking freely, carrying groceries, laughing, living lives that had once been theirs. The proximity was torture. Freedom was no longer abstract. It was visible, audible, taunting. Guards enforced the boundaries with ruthless clarity. Anyone caught too close to a gate without permission risked being shot. Smuggling attempts were punished publicly. Bodies were left in the street as warnings. Children learned quickly where not to walk, where not to look, how to disappear into crowds when soldiers appeared. Despite this, life inside the ghetto did not immediately collapse. People tried to recreate routines. Informal schools sprang up in apartments. Teachers gathered children in secret, whispering lessons while lookouts watched the stairs. Religious services continued quietly, stripped of ceremony, but not of meaning. People clung to habits because habits suggested continuity, and continuity suggested survival. Food became the central obsession. Every conversation circled back to it. Recipes were recited from memory. People argued over whether boiling potato peels twice made them less bitter. Mothers calculated calories obsessively, dividing rations with surgical precision. Fathers skipped meals without comment. Children learned to recognize hunger not as pain, but as normal. The Judenrat, Jewish councils imposed by the German authorities, were tasked with administering the ghettos. They faced impossible choices. They were ordered to distribute food that did not exist, to maintain order in conditions designed to produce chaos. Any resistance risked collective punishment. Any compliance implicated them in the machinery of oppression. Street scenes reflected the strain. People collapsed from exhaustion. Elderly men sat against walls, too weak to stand. Children begged, their faces hollow, eyes too large for their skulls. Theft increased, driven not by greed, but by desperation. A stolen crust of bread could mean the difference between life and death. Workshops were established inside some ghettos, producing uniforms, boots, and equipment for the German war effort. Those assigned to work received slightly larger rations. This created a hierarchy of survival. Those with jobs lived longer. Those without faded faster. Hunger became a sorting mechanism. The walls ensured that this system was sealed. No one could leave freely. No one could bring in food without risk. The ghetto became a closed ecosystem, slowly consuming itself. Calories entered at a trickle. Bodies burned energy constantly just to endure the conditions. The math was unforgiving. Winter intensified everything. Cold seeped through cracked walls and broken windows. Fuel was scarce. People burned furniture, books, anything that could produce heat. Fingers stiffened. Breath came out in white clouds inside apartments. Hunger deepened as bodies demanded more energy to stay warm. Deaths increased, quietly at first, then relentlessly. Carts began to appear, collecting bodies from the streets. Wrapped in blankets or sheets, they were stacked and taken away. There were too many for proper burials. Funerals became brief, hurried affairs, if they happened at all. Grief had no space to breathe. Still, beyond the walls, the city continued. Factories operated. Cafes served meals. Markets bustled. Trams ran on schedule. The contrast was obscene. The walls did not hide the suffering. They framed it. From above, the ghettos looked like dark stains on the city map. From inside, they felt like the entire world. And this was only the beginning. The walls were built to contain, but their deeper purpose was becoming clearer with each passing day. They were not meant to protect. They were meant to drain, to isolate, to reduce human beings to numbers, then to nothing. As hunger tightened its grip and disease spread unchecked, a new phase loomed. One that would take the logic of confinement and push it further, refining it into something even more lethal. The ghettos were now sealed. What happened inside them would soon determine who lived long enough to face what came next. Chapter 4. The Starvation Policy. The hunger did not arrive by accident. It was not the unintended result of war, nor the side effect of chaos or broken supply lines. It was designed, measured, and enforced with cold precision. Long before bodies began collapsing in the streets, the numbers had already been written down. Hunger was planned on paper first. Inside offices far from the ghetto streets, men in uniforms and pressed suits studied charts and tables. They calculated calories the way engineers calculate stress limits or fuel consumption. They discussed intake and output, productivity and depletion. Human beings were reduced to biological equations. How little food could be given before strength failed. How long a population could survive at the edge of starvation. How hunger could be used to control, weaken, and ultimately eliminate without firing a single shot. The result of those calculations became policy. Food rations were announced in official decrees, posted on walls, and read aloud by nervous intermediaries. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion. Listograms, allocations by category. Germans at the top, non-Jewish civilians below. Jews at the bottom, assigned quantities so small they barely qualified as nourishment. Bread measured in slivers. Fat reduced to a trace. Protein almost non-existent. On paper, it looked orderly. In reality, it was a death sentence stretched over weeks and months. Inside the ghettos, people tried at first to understand the numbers. They did the math over and over, hoping they had misunderstood. They had not. The daily ration provided less energy than the human body needed simply to exist. Even lying still, doing nothing, the body burned more calories than it was given. Every step, every breath, every shiver pushed people further into deficit. Hunger was no longer episodic. It was constant. It woke people before dawn with a dull ache that never fully faded. It followed them through the day, hollow and insistent. It gnawed at concentration, turned simple tasks into exhausting ordeals. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. People learned to conserve energy the way others conserve money. Food lines became the defining feature of ghetto life. They formed in the dark, hours before distribution began. People stood wrapped in thin coats, clutching bowls or tin cans, shifting their weight to stay warm. The smell of soup drifted from kitchens long before it was served, teasing the senses, making mouths water even as bodies weakened. Sometimes the line moved. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes the pot ran dry before everyone was served. Arguments broke out, sharp and sudden, fueled by hunger and despair. Others stood silently, too tired to speak. Children leaned against walls, their eyes fixed on nothing. Old men sat on the ground, no longer able to stand for hours at a time. The soup itself was a cruel parody of sustenance. Hot water clouded with a few shreds of cabbage. Occasionally a potato slice floated to the surface, triggering desperate glances, calculations of who needed it most. There was rarely meat, rarely fat. The calories were negligible, but the warmth kept people alive just a little longer. Inside apartments, cooking became an exercise in imagination as much as skill. People saved peelings and scraps, boiling them repeatedly to extract whatever nutrients remained. Bread was rationed down to crumbs, each piece chewed slowly, reverently. Families invented rituals to make meals feel larger than they were. Plates were set carefully. Food was served in courses, even when there was only one. The act of eating was stretched, made ceremonial, to trick the mind into believing there was enough. Hunger reshaped relationships. Parents lied to children, claiming they had already eaten. Children learned to lie back, hiding how weak they felt so they would not be a burden. Couples argued over portions, then apologized, ashamed of what hunger had turned them into. Love persisted, but it was strained, tested daily by the math of survival. Doctors watched the consequences unfold with helpless clarity. Weight loss was rapid and relentless. Faces grew gaunt. Eyes sank into sockets. Skin lost elasticity, hanging loosely over bone. Edema appeared in legs and feet, swelling caused by protein deficiency. People complained of dizziness, heart palpitations, constant cold. Wounds healed slowly, if at all. Minor infections became life-threatening. Medical professionals documented what they saw, writing detailed reports even as their patients died. They measured pulses, noted symptoms, tracked progression. These records would later become some of the most chilling evidence of deliberate starvation ever produced. At the time, they were acts of witness in a place designed to erase witnesses. Hunger also altered the mind. People became irritable, withdrawn, obsessive. Thoughts circled endlessly around food. Dreams were filled with banquets, bakeries, childhood meals. People woke up crying, the taste of imagined bread lingering on their tongues. Memory itself became a form of torture, replaying flavors and textures that might never be experienced again. Crime inside the ghetto increased, but it was not the crime of greed. It was the crime of need. Bread was stolen from pockets. Soup ladles were snatched mid-serving. Children slipped food from unattended bundles and ran. Those caught were beaten, sometimes killed, not always by guards. Hunger eroded moral boundaries, replacing them with raw instinct. And yet, moments of generosity still surfaced, startling in their quiet defiance. A crust shared, a spoonful passed across a table. Small acts that cost everything and meant more than words. The Germans understood this dynamic well. Starvation was not only about killing bodies. It was about breaking communities, about turning neighbors against each other, about forcing impossible choices that would linger as guilt and trauma long after death. Hunger isolated people inside themselves, making collective resistance harder, solidarity more fragile. Smuggling emerged as a direct response to the starvation policy. Children, small enough to slip through gaps in walls or crawl under fences, became lifelines. They carried bread hidden under clothes, potatoes tucked into sacks, sugar sewn into hems. Each trip risked arrest or execution. Guards shot without warning. Bodies were left at gates as reminders of the price of defiance. Despite the danger, smuggling continued. It had to. Without it, survival would have been impossible. The official rations alone could not sustain life. Every additional calorie meant another day lived, another chance, another breath. The Germans responded predictably. Punishments intensified. Entire buildings were searched. Families were beaten for food found hidden in walls. Public executions followed smuggling incidents, staged as warnings. The policy was clear. Hunger would be enforced violently. Inside the ghettos, hunger became visible everywhere. People moved more slowly. Lines grew longer. Streets filled with those too weak to work, sitting or lying against walls. Children's faces aged unnaturally fast, cheekbones protruding, eyes dulled. The sound of coughing became constant, echoing through stairwells and courtyards. Death crept in quietly at first. An elderly man found lifeless in his bed. A woman collapsing on the street. A child who simply did not wake up. Causes were listed as heart failure, pneumonia, exhaustion. The underlying cause was always the same: starvation. Carts began collecting bodies each morning. They rolled through the streets, wooden wheels rattling, stopping wherever death had claimed another victim overnight. Bodies were lifted without ceremony, wrapped if blankets were available, uncovered if not. Passers-by looked away or watched numbly. There was no space left for shock. Burials were rushed. Graves were shallow. Sometimes there were no graves at all. And still, the rations did not increase. If anything, they tightened. As ghettos grew more overcrowded and less productive, the German authorities reduced supplies further, arguing that the population was a burden. The logic was circular and lethal. Hunger weakened people, reducing their ability to work. Reduced productivity justified further starvation. It was a closed system designed to collapse inward. People understood this, even if they did not have a language for it. They felt it in their bones, in the way hope thinned alongside flesh. They sensed that hunger was not something to be endured temporarily. It was the point. And yet, life continued, stubborn and fragile. People still celebrated birthdays with imaginary cakes. They still marked holidays with whispered prayers and symbolic gestures. They still told stories, clinging to words when food was gone. These acts did not negate hunger. They existed alongside it, acts of defiance in a landscape designed to erase humanity. By now, the ghettos were places of visible decline. The streets were quieter, the laughter rarer, the energy drained away day by day. Hunger had reshaped everything, from the way people walked to the way they thought. It had become the central fact of existence, the force around which all other decisions revolved. And this was only one layer of the system. Because starvation was not the end goal. It was preparation. As bodies weakened and communities frayed, something darker was approaching. A next phase that would exploit hunger's damage, turning deprivation into selection. The policy had worked exactly as intended. And soon, its final purpose would become unmistakably clear. Chapter 5. Hunger becomes a clock. Hunger stopped being a sensation and became a measurement. Inside the ghettos, time was no longer counted by days or weeks, but by how long the body could continue without collapsing. People did not ask what day it was. They asked when they had last eaten and when they might eat again. Hunger became the clock that ruled every waking moment. At first, many tried to ignore it. They told themselves the pain would pass, that the body would adjust. And in a way it did. The sharp pangs of early hunger dulled into something deeper, heavier, more constant. A hollow pressure behind the eyes, a weakness in the knees, a cold that never fully left the bones. The body learned to conserve, slowing everything down, movement, thought, emotion. Mornings were the worst. People woke already exhausted, mouths dry, stomachs clenched tight. Sleep offered no relief, only dreams filled with food. Bread appeared in sleep with cruel clarity, the crackle of crust, the steam rising as it was torn open. People woke with their hands curled as if still holding it, only to feel the familiar emptiness return. Standing up took effort. Simple movements require planning. People learned to sit whenever possible, to lean against walls, to avoid unnecessary steps. Children, once restless, became quiet. They sat for long stretches, their energy gone, eyes following adults with a seriousness that did not belong to their age. Hunger changed the sound of the ghettos. Voices grew softer, conversations shorter. Laughter became rare, not because humor disappeared, but because laughing burned calories the body could not spare. Streets once filled with noise fell into a low murmur, punctuated by coughing fits and the rattle of carts collecting the dead. The smell of the ghetto was the smell of hunger. It was sour and stagnant, a mix of unwashed bodies, boiling scraps, and sickness. Makeshift stoves burned whatever could be found, wood pulled from furniture, paper, even books. Smoke hung low in courtyards and stairwells, stinging eyes already weakened by malnutrition. In summer, rot set in quickly. In winter, damp cold clung to everything. Doctors began to see starvation not just as weight loss, but as a systematic breakdown. Muscles wasted away first. Arms and legs thinned until bones were visible beneath the skin. Strength vanished. People who had once carried heavy loads could barely lift a pot of water. Then came the swelling. Feet and ankles ballooned grotesquely, a cruel illusion of fullness caused by protein deficiency. Faces looked bloated even as bodies wasted away. Hearts weakened. Pulses slowed. Blood pressure dropped. People fainted without warning, collapsing in the street or on staircases. Some never stood up again. Hunger dulled pain, but it sharpened fear. People became hyper-aware of their bodies, monitoring every sensation. A skipped heartbeat, a sudden wave of dizziness, a cramp that lingered too long. Each sign raised the same unspoken question. Is this the beginning of the end? Children suffered differently. Their bodies, still growing, had nothing to grow with. Growth stalled. Hair thinned. Bellies swelled while limbs wasted away. Many developed night blindness, stumbling after dusk, unable to see properly. Teachers noticed children forgetting lessons they had mastered months earlier. Hunger stole memory as easily as it stole strength. Parents watched this happen and felt helpless rage. They measured food obsessively, dividing portions with trembling hands. They counted bites, timed meals, tried to make hunger manageable through structure. Some fed children first and told themselves they could endure. Others made different choices, choices that would haunt them forever. Hunger forced decisions no parent should have to make. As bodies weakened, disease moved in effortlessly. Tuberculosis spread through overcrowded rooms. Pneumonia thrived in cold apartments with no fuel. Typhus, carried by lice, became rampant. Feverish patients lay on straw mattresses, delirious, burning calories they did not have. Without proper food, medicine had little effect. Recovery required nourishment that simply did not exist. Hospitals became places of quiet despair. Doctors and nurses worked with determination bordering on heroism, knowing they could not save most of those who came through the doors. They documented symptoms carefully, recording the progression of starvation in clinical language that barely concealed horror. They watched patients fade day by day, aware that knowledge was the only thing they could preserve. Hunger altered morality in subtle, devastating ways. People became suspicious. Trust eroded. Food could not be shared freely without risking one's own life. Friendships strained under the weight of survival. Theft increased, not out of malice, but necessity. A crust of bread could mean another day alive. Those caught stealing were sometimes beaten, sometimes killed, sometimes forgiven in silence. Judgment blurred in the face of starvation. And yet, even as hunger hollowed people out, moments of humanity persisted. A woman slipped a spoonful of soup to a stranger. A man gave his last piece of bread to a child who reminded him of his own. These acts did not change the outcome, but they mattered. They reminded people they were still human in a system designed to strip that away. Time itself began to feel distorted. Days blended together, indistinguishable except for the slight worsening of hunger. People marked time by physical decline, by how loose their clothes felt, by how many buttons no longer fastened, by how often someone failed to wake up in the morning. The dead became a daily presence. Bodies lay in doorways, on staircases, in courtyards. At first, passers-by stopped, whispered prayers, closed eyes. Eventually, they stepped around them. Hunger had taught efficiency. Grief had no calories left. Carts rolled through the ghetto each morning, their arrival expected, their sound familiar. The dead were collected quickly. There were too many for mourning, too many for names. Children watched this happen. They learned what a lifeless body looked like. They learned how still death was. They learned not to ask too many questions. Hunger aged them faster than any lesson ever could. Hunger also reshaped thought itself. People struggled to concentrate. Reading became difficult. Writing exhausting. Even listening required effort. Minds drifted, thoughts looping endlessly around food. Conversations returned again and again to imagined meals, remembered recipes, childhood feasts. Food became language, memory, fantasy. Dreams grew vivid and cruel. People dreamed of markets overflowing with bread, of tables bending under the weight of food. They woke up disoriented, sometimes crying, sometimes angry. The boundary between dream and waking life blurred, especially for those already weakened by malnutrition. For many, hunger erased the future. Planning beyond the next day felt pointless. Hope narrowed to the next meal, the next spoonful of soup. Long-term dreams, education, careers, family, faded quietly. Survival became the only goal. And still, the system tightened. Rations did not increase. If anything, they shrank. As deaths mounted, authorities used the decline as justification. Fewer people meant fewer supplies needed. Hunger fed on itself, accelerating the collapse. Those assigned to work clung to their jobs desperately. Work meant slightly more food, a few extra grams of bread, a thinner soup with a hint of fat. It was enough to make the difference between standing and collapsing, between living and dying. People fought to stay employed, even as their bodies failed them. Others, too weak to work, faded quickly. They sat in rooms growing darker by the day, unable to move, unable to eat enough to recover strength. Family members watched helplessly, knowing that without food, rest only delayed the inevitable. Hunger stripped away illusions. There was no fairness in who survived. Strong men died. Frail children lived longer than expected. Luck played a role. Timing mattered. A single smuggled potato could change everything. Or not. The body became the battlefield. Every calorie mattered. Every movement was weighed against its cost. People learned to exist at the bare minimum, their lives reduced to biological persistence. And through it all, the walls remained. They held hunger inside, concentrating it, magnifying its effects. They ensured that starvation could proceed uninterrupted, unseen by the outside world that continued its routines just beyond reach. By now, hunger was no longer something endured in the hope of relief. It was understood as permanent. And as the population weakened, as bodies thinned and spirits frayed, a terrible realization began to spread, unspoken but deeply felt. Hunger was not meant to kill everyone. It was meant to decide who would be left when the next stage began. And that stage was already moving closer, waiting for bodies weak enough to be moved, minds exhausted enough to obey. The clock kept ticking, and it was counting down. Chapter 6: Smuggling. The lifeline. The hunger created the need. The walls created the risk. And between them, something fragile and extraordinary took shape. Smuggling was not a crime born of greed. It was a reflex of survival. It was the thin line between collapse and endurance, between disappearance and one more day alive. It began almost immediately after the ghettos were sealed. At first, it was hesitant, improvised, driven by instinct rather than organization. A gap beneath a fence noticed during a patrol change. A window that had not been fully bricked over. A sewer opening that led somewhere uncertain but free. People watched, memorized routines, learned where guards lingered and where they did not. Hunger sharpened observation. Fear taught precision. Children were the first to move. They were small enough to slip through spaces adults could not. Thin enough to pass unnoticed in shadows. Fast enough to run when shots rang out. They crawled under wire, squeezed through cracks, climbed through ruins that once were doorways. Their hands scraped raw against brick and metal. Their knees bled. Their lungs burned as they ran. And still they went, again and again, because they had to. Outside the walls, food still existed. Bread was baked. Potatoes were sold. Markets still functioned for those allowed to enter them. Smugglers reached these places like survivors reaching air, grabbing whatever they could carry. A loaf tucked under a shirt. A sack of flour balanced awkwardly. Sugar poured into pockets and sewn into hems. Fat wrapped in rags, pressed flat against the body. Every trip was a calculation. How much weight could be carried without slowing down? How visible a bulge might be? How far one could run before collapsing? How likely it was that a guard would fire without warning? The answers changed daily. Patrols shifted. Gaps closed. New dangers emerged. The walls were alive with risk. Guards shot smugglers on sight. There were no warnings. No negotiations. A child caught with bread could be beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Bodies were often left where they fell, displayed deliberately. A lesson carved into the street. A message written in blood. Inside the ghetto, people waited. They waited near entry points, listening for footsteps, watching for movement. They scanned faces as children emerged, counting heads, bracing for the moment when someone did not return. Relief and grief lived side by side, often in the same breath. When food made it through, it was distributed quickly, quietly. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just urgent division. Bread torn into uneven pieces. Potatoes counted and recounted. Each item represented calories that could be stretched, combined, transformed into another day of life. Smuggled food fed entire buildings, sometimes entire streets. It propped up soup kitchens. It sustained workers. It kept children alive just long enough to grow another inch thinner. Smuggling reshaped family roles. Children became providers. Parents became lookouts. Mothers hid food in walls, under floors, inside bedding. Fathers coordinated routes, negotiated exchanges, stood guard when needed. Authority inverted. Experience yielded to agility. Youth became an advantage in a world designed to destroy it. The Germans understood exactly what smuggling represented. It was a direct threat to the starvation policy. Every loaf that crossed the wall undermined the math. Every potato disrupted the timetable. And so repression intensified. Guards doubled. Searches increased. Punishments became collective. A single smuggler caught could mean an entire building beaten, fined, or starve further. Public executions followed. Smugglers were shot in front of crowds. Children were forced to watch. Parents were forced to watch. The intention was clear. Fear would do what bullets alone could not. Fear would close the gaps. But hunger was stronger than fear. Smuggling adapted. Routes shifted. Networks grew more sophisticated. Lookouts signaled with hand gestures, coughs, scraps of cloth tied to windows. Codes were invented and abandoned. Entire systems rose and fell in weeks. It was chaotic, but it worked. Not all smugglers were children. Some adults took the risk despite the odds. Laborers who still had strength. Women who disguised themselves as non-Jews. Men who memorized patrol schedules with military precision. They moved carefully, blending into crowds, slipping through moments of distraction. Each successful run felt like stealing fire. Food was not the only thing smuggled. Medicine crossed the walls when possible. Soap, bandages, newspapers, letters. News itself became a form of nourishment, reminding people that the world had not entirely vanished. These items carried hope alongside calories, a reminder that existence extended beyond the walls. Inside the ghetto, smuggling created a shadow economy. Food was traded, bartered, shared. Prices fluctuated wildly, driven by scarcity and risk. A loaf of bread could cost a coat. A handful of sugar could buy a pair of shoes. People liquidated their lives piece by piece, converting possessions into nourishment. Moral lines blurred. Some exploited the system, hoarding or reselling at cruel prices. Others redistributed quietly, refusing payment. Hunger exposed both the worst and the best in people. Judgment became complicated. Survival left little room for purity. The physical toll on smugglers was immense. Children who ran daily routes grew gaunt faster than others. The calories they carried often went to siblings or parents, not themselves. Many collapsed from exhaustion. Some disappeared. Others returned wounded, shaken, silent. Their childhoods ended at the wall. Parents lived with constant terror. Every trip out was a gamble. Every delay felt like a death sentence. They tried to forbid their children from going, then relented, knowing the alternative was slower, certain death. The guilt was unbearable. The need was stronger. Guards learned to anticipate patterns. They watched for nervous movements, for children who ran too often, for bulges beneath clothing. They staged ambushes. They pretended not to see smugglers, then struck suddenly. The wall became a hunting ground. Despite this, smuggling never fully stopped. It slowed. It surged. It adapted. It was as persistent as hunger itself. When one route closed, another opened. When one group was destroyed, another formed. The need regenerated endlessly. Inside the ghettos, smuggled food changed the rhythm of survival. Those with access lived longer. Children who smuggled gained leverage. Entire households depended on the success of a single runner. Smuggling did not eliminate hunger, but it delayed its worst effects. It bought time, and time mattered. Time in another winter survived. Another disease resisted. Another chance that something, anything, might change. The Germans responded with walls within walls, sealing openings, reinforcing fences, adding watchtowers, installing lighting to expose movement at night. The ghettos became brighter, harsher, more controlled. Each improvement narrowed the margin for error. Deaths mounted. Smugglers shot at gates. Children crushed in collapses. Adults beaten to death during searches. The price was horrific, and yet, the calculus remained the same. Without smuggling, everyone would starve faster. Hunger demanded courage from those least equipped to give it. Children learned to move silently, to read faces instantly, to lie convincingly, to run until lungs screamed. Their lives were reduced to a single function: bring food back alive. Some succeeded again and again, becoming legends whispered about in stairwells. Others failed once, and that was enough. Inside the ghettos, people measured hope by footsteps, by the sound of a child returning, by the rustle of a hidden sack, by the smell of bread that did not belong to the official ration. These moments felt miraculous, fragile, unbearably precious. Smuggling became resistance without weapons. It defied the logic of starvation. It rejected the role assigned by policy. It insisted, stubbornly, that life would not be reduced to numbers without a fight. But it was also unsustainable. As the population weakened, fewer could run. As patrols tightened, fewer routes remained. As punishments escalated, fear deepened. The balance tipped slowly, inexorably. By now, The ghettos were dependent on smuggling to survive at all, and the authorities knew it, which meant the next phase would target the lifeline itself, not just the hunger it fed. As walls thickened and bullets flew more freely, a question hung, unspoken in the air. What happens when even smuggling can no longer keep people alive? The answer was already forming, just beyond the walls, waiting for the moment when hunger and fear had done their work. And that moment was approaching. Chapter 7: Kitchens, Committees, and Impossible Choices. Every system built to save lives inside the ghetto was forced to operate inside a lie. The lie was that survival could be managed, that hunger could be organized, that starvation could be softened with paperwork, schedules, and bowls lined neatly on tables. Kitchens were opened, committees were formed, ration cards were stamped, and lists were compiled, all under the shadow of a policy designed to make these efforts fail. The soup kitchens appeared first because hunger demanded something visible, something immediate. Large rooms were cleared, school halls, abandoned shops, synagogues stripped to benches. Enormous pots were dragged in and set over makeshift stoves. Water was poured, then more water, then a little more, until it filled the containers almost to the brim. Only then were ingredients added. Cabbage leaves, potato peelings, sometimes a handful of barley if someone had managed to procure it. The soup was stirred slowly, not because it required care, but because stirring gave the illusion of abundance. From early morning, lines formed outside these kitchens. People wrapped in coats too thin for the season, hands clutching tin cups, bowls chipped and cracked from use. They stood pressed together, the smell of unwashed bodies mixing with steam escaping through doors and windows. Hunger sharpened every sense. The faintest scent of boiling vegetables could make knees weaken. The sound of ladles scraping the bottom of a pot felt like a threat. When doors opened, movement surged forward in waves. Volunteers shouted instructions, trying to impose order on bodies driven by need. Everyone feared the same thing, that the soup would run out before their turn came. And often it did. Those who reached the front received a portion measured carefully, ruthlessly. Ladles dipped, rose, paused just long enough to drain excess liquid, then tipped into waiting bowls. The soup was thin enough to see through. It was hot, though, and that mattered. Heat tricked the body into feeling fed, even if only briefly. People drank slowly, savoring warmth more than flavor. For many, this was the only guaranteed meal of the day. The committees that organized these kitchens were composed of people trapped between impossible demands. The Judenrat, Jewish councils imposed by the occupying authorities, were ordered to maintain order, distribute food, and keep the ghetto functioning. Failure meant punishment, removal, sometimes execution. Compliance meant facilitating a system designed to kill their own people slowly. They worked from cramped offices, hunched over ledgers filled with names and numbers. Who would receive soup today? Who would receive bread? Who was deemed able to work? Who was no longer productive? Each decision carried weight measured not in ink, but in lives. Ration cards were printed, distributed, stamped. They promised structure, fairness, equality. In reality, they promised scarcity, parceled out with the cold authority of mathematics. A card did not guarantee food. It only granted permission to stand in line. Committees debated endlessly. Should children be prioritized? The elderly? Workers whose labor brought slightly more food into the ghetto? Every option meant someone else would go hungry. Every choice created resentment, accusations, whispered anger in stairwells and courtyards. Mothers argued that children needed food to grow. Doctors argued that the sick needed nourishment to recover. Administrators argued that workers needed calories to keep production going. All were right. None could be satisfied. The kitchens became places of quiet conflict. People watched one another's bowls. They counted ladlefuls. They accused volunteers of favoritism. They pleaded. They bribed. They threatened. Hunger distorted perception, turning small differences into unbearable injustices. A slightly fuller bowl could spark shouting. A missed day could mean collapse. Volunteers bore the brunt of this tension. They worked long hours for no pay, often receiving no more food than those they served. They were insulted, cursed, sometimes attacked. And still they returned each day, because the alternative was to let the system collapse entirely. Many believed that even a failed system was better than none at all. Inside apartments, food distribution became a daily ritual of precision. Bread was weighed, sliced into exact portions. Parents used knives to divide crusts with surgeon-like care. Children learned not to ask for more. Meals were scheduled to create the illusion of regularity. Morning, afternoon, evening, even when the total amount barely equaled a single pre-war snack. Some families introduced rules to preserve dignity. Everyone sat at the table. No one ate standing up. Prayers were whispered, even when faith wavered. These gestures mattered. They reminded people they were still human, not animals scrambling for scraps. Others abandoned ceremony altogether. They ate whenever food appeared, devouring it quickly before hunger could steal it again. There was no right way to starve, only ways that felt slightly less unbearable. Committees also managed housing, another impossible task. Overcrowding meant that any redistribution of space created conflict. Families were forced to share rooms with strangers. Sick people lay next to healthy ones. Privacy disappeared. Tensions flared over food storage, cooking smells, noise. Hunger amplified every irritation. Kitchens inside buildings emerged, informal and fragile. A single pot shared by multiple families. A schedule for boiling water. Contributions pooled. One potato here, a handful of flour there. These micro-communities became lifelines. They also became sites of heartbreak when supplies ran out. Children hovered constantly around kitchens. They watched adults cook, memorized movements, inhaled smells that tormented them. Some tried to help, hoping proximity would earn an extra sip. Others waited outside, bowls ready, eyes hollow. Hunger aged them quickly. Play disappeared, replaced by vigilance. The sick were hardest to manage. Doctors begged for special rations for patients with tuberculosis, typhus, severe malnutrition. Committees recorded these requests, knowing they could not fulfill them. There was no hidden reserve, no emergency supply. Granting extra food to one patient meant taking it from another. Hospitals became places of tragic irony. They existed to heal, but healing required food. Without it, beds filled with patients who could not recover. Nurses spooned thin broth into mouths too weak to swallow. Doctors watched as conditions worsened, powerless to intervene meaningfully. Starvation forced choices that left permanent scars. A mother deciding whether to give her portion to her child or keep it to stay strong enough to smuggle. A son choosing whether to steal bread from a neighbor or watch his father die. A committee member deciding which name to strike from a list when supplies ran short. These were not moral failures. They were traps. Rumors spread constantly that new supplies were coming, that the authorities would increase rations, that international organizations might intervene. People clung to these stories, passing them along kitchens and corridors, because hope required fuel too. Most rumors dissolved quickly. Hunger remained. Corruption crept in, as it always does under extreme scarcity. Some committee members skimmed supplies. Some volunteers favored friends or relatives. Some hoarded. These acts were condemned loudly, sometimes violently. But hunger complicated judgment. Lines between survival and exploitation blurred. Still, many resisted corruption fiercely. They documented every gram distributed. They held public meetings. They tried to impose transparency, knowing trust was as fragile as bread. In some places, these efforts held. In others, they collapsed under pressure. As time passed, the kitchens became quieter. Lines shortened not because food increased, but because people disappeared. Death thinned the crowds. Weakness kept many from standing for hours. Those who still came were thinner, slower, quieter. Hunger had settled into bones and minds alike. The committees noticed this decline in their ledgers. Numbers dropped. Names vanished. Entire families disappeared between one distribution and the next. The records grew heavier with absence. And still, the demands from above did not change. Production quotas remained. Order was expected. Reports were required. The machinery of administration continued, indifferent to the suffering it documented. Inside the ghetto, people understood something fundamental. The kitchens were not a solution. They were a delay, a way to stretch life just long enough for the next phase to arrive. Hunger was being managed, not defeated, parceled out carefully so it could do its work thoroughly. And yet, without the kitchens, collapse would have been immediate. They were cruel and necessary at the same time. As winter deepened and supplies shrank further, committees faced even harsher decisions. Soup was diluted again. Bread rations were cut. Days were added between distributions. The clock of hunger ticked louder. People began to sense that something was shifting. The authorities' interest in maintaining even the appearance of care waned. Inspections grew rarer. Supplies grew thinner. The system felt less like neglect and more like abandonment. The kitchens kept operating, but the question changed. Not how to feed everyone, but who could be kept alive a little longer. That question hung over every pot, every ladle, every list, and it pointed forward, toward a moment when even these fragile structures would no longer be tolerated, when kitchens would fall silent, when committees would be dissolved, when hunger would no longer need management, because another solution had been chosen. The signs were subtle, at first, but they were unmistakable to those already counting their lives in spoonfuls. Something worse was coming. Chapter 8: Disease Follows Hunger. The sickness did not arrive suddenly. It crept in the way hunger did, quietly at first, almost politely, slipping through cracks already opened by starvation. Long before epidemics were declared, long before doctors spoke in urgent tones, bodies had already begun to fail. Hunger had prepared the ground. Disease simply claimed it. At first, it was just coughing, a dry, persistent sound echoing through stairwells and crowded rooms. People dismissed it as the cold, as exhaustion, as something temporary. Then the fevers came, low at first, then rising, burning through bodies that no longer had the strength to fight back. Sweat-soaked bedding, even in winter. Teeth chattered uncontrollably. Hunger and illness began to overlap, feeding into one another until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Overcrowding turned every room into a breeding ground. Families packed into single apartments shared air that never truly refreshed. Windows stayed shut against the cold, trapping moisture and breath inside. The smell of sickness settled into walls and fabric, sharp and sour. Lice moved easily from body to body, invisible couriers carrying death. Typhus followed them like a shadow. Doctors saw the pattern immediately. Malnutrition weakened immune systems to the point of collapse. Bodies starved of protein and fat could not produce resistance. Infections that once would have been mild became fatal. A simple cold turned into pneumonia. A small cut festered and spread. Diarrhea drained what little strength remained. Hunger made recovery impossible. Hospitals inside the ghettos were overwhelmed almost as soon as they opened. Patients lay packed into rooms, sometimes two to a bed, sometimes on the floor. There were never enough blankets, never enough medicine, never enough food. Nurses moved quietly between bodies, their shoes worn thin, their faces drawn. They spoke softly, conserving energy, conserving hope. Many were starving themselves. The smell inside these wards was unmistakable. Sweat, disinfectant when it was available, right when it was not. The sound was worse. Labored breathing, moaning, the rasp of lungs filling with fluid, the silence that followed when a breath did not return. Typhus spread fastest, carried by lice thriving in unwashed clothing and overcrowded conditions. It struck suddenly. High fever, delirium, rash. Patients babbled incoherently, reliving memories, calling out names. Some tore at their clothing, driven by hallucinations. Others lay motionless, eyes open, staring at nothing. Doctors knew exactly what was happening and exactly why. They had studied epidemics before the war. They understood sanitation, nutrition, prevention. None of it mattered here. Without soap, without clean water, without food, knowledge became documentation rather than intervention. They wrote reports knowing that writing was all they had left. Tuberculosis followed more slowly, but just as relentlessly. It preyed on weakness. Persistent coughs deepened, streaked with blood. Weight loss accelerated beyond what hunger alone could explain. Patients wasted away until their bones pressed against skin like edges beneath paper. There was no isolation possible. The sick slept beside the healthy. The infection moved freely. Children suffered brutally. Their bodies, already deprived of nutrients needed for growth, could not withstand illness. Fevers burned hotter. Dehydration came faster. Many slipped into quiet lethargy, lying still for hours, too weak to cry. Parents watched for signs of breathing, terrified of falling asleep and waking too late. Mothers became amateur nurses. They cooled foreheads with damp cloths. They whispered reassurances. They begged doctors for medicine they knew did not exist. Some traded their own food rations for a spoonful of sugar water, anything to keep a child alive one more night. Hunger forced impossible calculations. Should scarce calories be given to the sick, who might not survive anyway, or to the healthy, who might still be saved? There was no correct answer. Every choice felt like betrayal. Families argued in whispers, then fell silent, ashamed of thoughts they could not stop thinking. The dead accumulated faster now. Bodies were no longer only those who had starved slowly. Illness accelerated the pace. People died in clusters. Entire rooms emptied within days. The carts came more often, sometimes twice a day. The sound of wheels on cobblestone became a grim clock marking loss. Burial rituals vanished. There was no time, no strength, no space. Names were forgotten quickly, not from indifference, but from overload. Grief stacked on grief until it became numbness. Doctors and nurses died alongside their patients. Exposure, hunger, exhaustion took them one by one. Clinics lost staff faster than they could be replaced. Medical students stepped in, then teenagers, then anyone willing to help. Skill gave way to necessity. Compassion became the only remaining qualification. Still, records were kept. Weight charts, symptom lists, mortality rates. Doctors wrote with shaking hands, documenting the progression of starvation-induced disease with scientific clarity. These notes would later stand as evidence that what happened was not mysterious, not unavoidable. It was predictable. It was engineered. The authorities responded not with aid, but with containment. Quarantines were declared within ghettos, already sealed. Buildings were marked. Doors were locked. Entire households were cut off, left to survive or die without assistance. Fear of disease became another weapon, isolating people further. People whispered that illness was safer than starvation. At least fever ended things quickly. At least delirium dulled hunger's edge. These thoughts frightened those who had them, but they spread anyway, born from despair. The smell of death changed. It lingered longer. It clung to stairwells, to clothing, to hair. People recognized it instantly, the way one recognizes smoke. It meant someone nearby was already gone, or about to be. Children learned to avoid certain buildings. They knew which staircases echoed with coughing, which rooms were silent for too long. They learned to step around bodies without looking down. Disease taught them efficiency. Inside homes, isolation broke down completely. People stopped pretending sickness could be contained. They shared beds with the feverish. They drank from the same cups. They accepted that infection was inevitable. Hunger had already stripped away the illusion of safety. Disease finished the job. The outside world remained close enough to mock them. Beyond the walls, hospitals functioned. Medicine was used. Epidemics were controlled. The contrast was obscene. Disease inside the ghettos was not the result of ignorance. It was the result of deliberate deprivation. As weeks passed, illness reshaped the population. Those who survived were the ones whose bodies, by chance or constitution, endured longer. Strength had little to do with it. Luck mattered more. Timing mattered. A single missed exposure. A single extra potato. The ghettos grew quieter. Coughing replaced conversation. Movement slowed further. Entire buildings fell silent except for the sound of flies. Hunger and disease together drained the last reserves of energy. By now, survival felt less like living and more like waiting. Waiting to see who would fall next. Waiting for fever to come or pass. Waiting for the carts. Waiting for something, anything, to change. People began to sense that disease was not an unintended consequence. It was part of the system. Hunger weakened. Overcrowding infected. Isolation prevented help. Each element reinforced the others. The result was efficient, devastating, and almost invisible to those outside the walls. Inside, it was unmistakable. The ghettos were becoming places where death no longer needed bullets. It arrived quietly, through coughing fits and fever dreams, through bodies too weak to resist. And as illness claimed more and more lives, the population thinned, weakened, and exhausted. Another realization took hold. Those who survived hunger and disease were being shaped into something the authorities wanted. A population already broken, already depleted, already prepared, and whatever came next would not need to fight resistance that no longer had the strength to stand. Disease had done its work. The system was ready to move forward. Chapter 9. Children of the Ghettos. They learned hunger before they learned fear. Before they understood why walls existed or why soldiers shouted, they understood the ache in their stomachs. Children inside the ghettos did not experience childhood as a protected space. It was something stripped away piece by piece, replaced by vigilance, responsibility, and the quiet understanding that survival was never guaranteed. At first glance, they still looked like children. Small bodies, oversized coats, shoes tied with string because leather wore out faster than replacements could be found. But their faces told a different story. Eyes too serious, movements too careful, a stillness that belonged to adults who had seen too much. Hunger reshaped them faster than it did anyone else. Their bodies were still growing, demanding nutrients that did not exist. Bones lengthened without muscle to support them. Bellies swelled while arms and legs thinned. Hair lost its shine, then its color. Teeth loosened. Cuts refused to heal. Many stopped growing entirely, trapped in bodies that no longer followed time's rules. They woke early, not because they were rested, but because hunger would not let them sleep. Mornings began with the same question every day. Would there be food today? Would there be soup? Would someone bring bread? The answer was never certain. School, when it existed, became an act of defiance. Teachers gathered children in secret rooms, whispering lessons while lookouts watched stairwells. Chalk scratched softly on boards scavenged from demolished buildings. Books were shared, passed hand to hand, their pages smudged and torn. Children struggled to concentrate. Hunger made letters blur. Words slipped away moments after being learned. Still they came. Learning was proof that the future had not been completely erased. Play did not disappear entirely. It changed. Games became quieter, slower. Children sat in circles telling stories, imagining meals they remembered from before the walls. They traded descriptions of food like treasures. Who remembered the taste of honey? Who remembered apples fresh from the market? These memories were not indulgences. They were anchors, proof that life had once been different. Laughter, when it came, felt dangerous. It drew attention. It burned energy. But sometimes it burst out anyway, sudden and uncontrollable, startling even the children themselves. For a moment, they sounded like they used to. Then hunger reclaimed them, and silence returned. Many children worked, not in factories, but in the shadows that kept families alive. They ran messages. They scavenged. They waited in lines for soup while adults collapsed from exhaustion. Most dangerously, they smuggled. Their size made them ideal for slipping through gaps in walls, crawling through ruins, darting past guards. They memorized patrol schedules the way other children memorized multiplication tables. They learned which guards looked away and which fired without warning. Each trip outside the ghetto was a gamble measured in heartbeats. Some returned with bread tucked under shirts too thin to hide it well. Others returned with potatoes, sugar, scraps of fat. Some did not return at all. Parents lived with constant terror. Every time a child left, They imagined gunfire. They imagined bodies left in the street. They told themselves this would be the last trip, then allowed another, and another, because without smuggling, survival was impossible. Hunger forced parents to sacrifice the very thing they were meant to protect. Children understood this, even when adults tried to hide it. They carried food back with a seriousness that felt unnatural, handing it over without complaint, without celebration. Many refused to eat first. They insisted siblings or parents needed it more. Childhood generosity became survival strategy. Inside the ghetto, orphans multiplied quickly. Disease, starvation, executions stripped children of parents with brutal efficiency. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbors already struggling to survive. Others lived alone, drifting between buildings, sleeping wherever space could be found. These children learned to disappear, to blend into crowds, to beg without being noticed. Street children formed loose groups, sharing information and scraps. They knew which kitchens were more generous, which buildings offered shelter, which adults might trade food for errands. Their lives were precarious, balanced on instinct and chance. Many did not survive long. The psychological toll was immense. Children witnessed death daily. Bodies in stairwells, friends collapsing in the street, parents growing weaker by the week. Grief became constant background noise, something felt but rarely discussed. There was no space for processing loss. Survival consumed everything. Nightmares were common. Children woke screaming, dreaming of being chased, shot, trapped. Others stopped dreaming altogether, their sleep shallow and restless. Hunger robbed them even of imagination's refuge. Some children took on adult roles entirely. They managed households. They negotiated trades. They made decisions far beyond their years. Authority inverted. Parents deferred to children who had energy, connections, agility. This reversal carried its own trauma, burdening young minds with responsibility they could not shed. Religion and ritual took on new meanings. Children who once learned prayers by rote now clung to them as lifelines. Some lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile suffering with belief. Others deepened their devotion, reciting words that promised meaning even when reality offered none. Both responses were acts of survival. Art became another outlet. Children drew with charcoal on scraps of paper, on walls, on cardboard scavenged for packaging. They sketched houses with windows open to the world, tables laden with food, families intact. These images were not fantasies. They were memories reconstructed, futures imagined, because the present was unbearable. Teachers noticed changes in behavior. Children became quieter, more withdrawn. Some lashed out suddenly, anger erupting without warning. Hunger affected impulse control, emotion regulation, attention. Educators adapted, offering structure when they could, kindness when structure failed. Illness ravaged children mercilessly. Typhus swept through cramped rooms, striking small bodies harder and faster. Tuberculosis hollowed them out. Diarrhea dehydrated them quickly, draining what little strength remained. Many children died within days of first symptoms. Parents watched helplessly, knowing food could have saved them. Doctors documented these deaths with despairing precision. They recorded weights dropping below survivable thresholds. They noted stunted growth, developmental delays, cognitive decline. These were not abstractions. They were children whose names they knew, whose drawings hung on clinic walls. Despite everything, children resisted in their own ways. They mocked guards quietly behind their backs. They passed messages. They warned each other of danger. They shared food when they could. Resistance did not always look like weapons. Sometimes it looked like refusing to give up entirely. Some children became messengers for underground movements. Their youth made them less suspicious. They carried notes hidden in clothing, memorized instructions, relayed information between groups. The risks were enormous. So was the necessity. The Germans understood the role children played. Punishments targeted them deliberately. Smugglers were shot publicly. Curfews tightened. Entire families were punished for a child's actions. The goal was clear: Break the will by breaking the future. Inside the ghetto, the presence of children was both hope and torment. They represented continuity, the possibility of something beyond starvation and walls. But they also embodied vulnerability, a constant reminder of what was being destroyed. Parents measured survival in their children's breaths. They counted ribs. They monitored color in cheeks. They celebrated small victories. A day without fever, a few extra spoonfuls of soup. Each moment felt borrowed. As time passed, the number of children dwindled. Deaths accumulated. Deportations loomed. The population grew older, quieter, thinner. The absence of children was its own kind of silence, heavier than noise. Those who remained were changed forever. They had learned skills no child should need. They had seen what adults could not stop. They carried memories that would shape them long after the walls fell, if they lived to see that day. Hunger had aged them. Fear had sharpened them. Loss had hollowed them out. And yet, even now, they found moments of defiance. A whispered joke, a shared crumb, a drawing hidden beneath a mattress. These acts did not stop the system, but they resisted erasure. They insisted on presence in a place designed to extinguish it. As the ghettos weakened and the machinery of destruction shifted gears, children stood at the center of an unspoken calculation. They were too weak to work, too young to resist openly, too visible to ignore, and that made them dangerous to a system that measured worth only in utility and control. What would happen to them when hunger and disease had done all they could? The answer was approaching, and for the children of the ghettos, time was running out faster than for anyone else. Chapter 10. Culture Under Starvation. On nights when the hunger was loudest, when stomachs burned and sleep refused to come, people gathered anyway. They gathered not around food, but around words, melodies, memories. In rooms where candles sputtered and air barely moved, culture survived not because it was practical, but because without it, survival would have meant nothing at all. At first, these gatherings were hesitant. A whispered poem, a song hummed under the breath, a few lines of scripture recited from memory. People feared attention. They feared wasting energy. But hunger had already taken so much that silence felt like surrender. Culture became a way to push back, not against starvation itself, but against the erasure it demanded. Music returned quietly. A violin rescued from pawnshop, a harmonica hidden in a coat lining, a voice rising carefully so it would not carry beyond thin walls. Familiar melodies spread through crowded rooms, stirring memories of weddings, holidays, evenings when music meant celebration rather than defiance. People closed their eyes and listened, letting sound do what food could not, fill them, if only briefly. The act of listening became communal nourishment. People leaned closer, sharing warmth, sharing breath. For a few minutes, hunger loosened its grip. Shoulders relaxed. Faces softened. When the music stopped, the emptiness rushed back, but something had shifted. They remembered themselves. Theater followed. Not grand productions, but improvised performances staged in cellars, attics, abandoned classrooms. Scripts were memorized because paper was scarce and dangerous to keep. Costumes were suggested rather than worn. A scarf became a symbol. A hat indicated a different character. Audiences packed in tightly, standing or sitting on the floor, bodies pressed together. The stories varied. Some were comic, sharp with irony, mocking the absurdities of ghetto life. Laughter erupted suddenly, almost violently, surprising those who heard it. Laughter burned calories, but it also burned fear. Other plays were tragic, drawn from history or scripture, reflecting suffering with brutal honesty. Tears flowed freely. There was no need to hide them. These performances were not escapes. They were mirrors. They allowed people to see themselves not as victims alone, but as participants in a long human story of endurance, loss, and meaning. In a system designed to reduce them to numbers, culture insisted on names. Poetry flourished in the margins. It was written on scraps of paper, on the backs of ration cards, in notebooks hidden beneath floorboards. Poets wrote about hunger with unsparing clarity, about the taste of soup that was more water than food, about children growing silent, about streets that smelled of death. They also wrote about love, about memory, about landscapes beyond the walls. Words became a form of resistance precisely because they could not be easily confiscated. They lived in minds, passed from person to person, recited aloud, altered, remembered. Even when the paper was destroyed, the poems survived as sound. Diaries multiplied. People documented daily life with obsessive detail. What they ate, how much they weighed, who died, who disappeared. These records were not written for comfort. They were written to prove that this happened. That hunger was not imagined. That suffering was deliberate. Some writers knew they would not survive. They wrote anyway, hiding notebooks in walls, burying them beneath rubble, entrusting them to others with whispered instructions. Their words were messages sent forward in time, demanding witness. Education continued underground. Teachers refused to let knowledge starve. Classes met in secret, rotating locations to avoid detection. Lessons were shortened to conserve energy, but they continued. Mathematics, history, literature. Children recited while seated to avoid fainting. Teachers adjusted expectations, praised effort over accuracy, knowing that concentration itself was an achievement. Learning became symbolic. It declared belief in a future that hunger insisted did not exist. Each lesson was an act of faith, each memorized poem a refusal to accept extinction. Religion adapted. Synagogues were sealed or destroyed, but prayer did not vanish. It moved into apartments, stairwells, whispered circles. Rituals were abbreviated, altered, sometimes questioned entirely. Faith fractured under the weight of starvation. Some lost belief, furious at a God who allowed children to starve. Others clung more tightly, reciting prayers through tears. Arguments erupted quietly, about justice, about meaning, about whether suffering had purpose or was simply cruelty. These debates were intense, personal, unresolved. Hunger stripped away pretense. It forced belief to confront reality without comfort. Art emerged wherever materials could be found. Charcoal drawings on cardboard, paint made from crushed brick and soot, sculptures fashioned from scrap metal and wood. Artists depicted scenes from before the war, markets, homes, family gatherings, alongside scenes from the present, walls, guards, starving figures. The contrast was intentional. It recorded loss. Children drew obsessively. They sketched food in vivid detail. Cakes layered high, tables bending under weight, fruit spilling from bowls. These images were not indulgent fantasies. They were expressions of memory and need, a way to process hunger that words could not touch. Culture also carried danger. Public gatherings risked discovery. Performances could be raided. Possession of certain writings could mean arrest or worse. People learned to hide quickly, to scatter at the first sign of patrols. Lookouts stood guard. Codes were developed. A knock meant silence. Despite the risk, participation grew. As starvation deepened, people clung harder to meaning. Culture did not fill stomachs, but it filled something else entirely. It reminded people why survival mattered. The Germans understood this. Cultural life threatened the narrative of dehumanization. It proved that hunger had not reduced people to animals. It showed thought, creativity, community. And so repression increased. Gatherings were banned. Instruments confiscated. Writers arrested. Performers beaten. The response was adaptation. Smaller groups. Quieter performances. Words memorized instead of written. Songs hummed rather than sung. Culture went underground, resilient and elusive. Humor sharpened. Jokes circulated that cut through despair with bitter precision. They mocked guards, mocked bureaucracy, mocked hunger itself. Humor was dangerous because it exposed the absurdity of power. It reclaimed agency in a place designed to strip it away. Not everyone participated. Some were too weak, too ill, too consumed by hunger to engage. Culture was not universal salvation. It was one strand of resistance among many, available unevenly, embraced differently. But its presence mattered, even to those who never attended a performance. Knowing it existed changed the atmosphere. The ghettos were not silent places. They hummed with suppressed life, with whispered arguments, with remembered songs, with stories told and retold until they became collective property. This hum was fragile, easily disrupted, but persistent. As deportations loomed and rumors spread, cultural expression took on new urgency. People rushed to record what they could, to teach children one more poem, to perform one more play, to write one more page. There was an unspoken understanding that time was running out. Farewells were embedded in art. Poems ended abruptly. Songs lingered on unresolved notes. Performances closed with silence rather than applause. These choices reflected reality. There were no neat endings here. Culture also preserved dignity in death. Funeral prayers, when possible, were spoken with care. Names were remembered. Stories were shared. Even when bodies were buried hastily or not at all, memory stood in as ritual. The impact of this cultural resistance extended beyond the walls. Some writings were smuggled out. Some songs survived through those who escaped. These fragments would later become evidence, testimony, history. Without them, much would have been lost in numbers and reports. Inside the ghettos, people felt the pressure building. Hunger, disease, fear, and now something else. A tightening. A sense that the authorities' patience with even symbolic resistance was thinning. Cultural life, once tolerated as harmless, began to feel dangerous. People debated whether to continue. Was it worth the risk? Was it selfish to spend energy on art when children starved? These questions had no answers. People chose differently. Some withdrew. Others intensified their efforts, convinced that if death was coming, it should not arrive in silence. The walls still stood. The kitchen still functioned, barely. Smuggling still brought occasional relief. But beneath all of it, a shift was occurring. The system was preparing to move from containment to removal. Culture sensed this before policy announced it. Artists felt urgency sharpen. Teachers spoke faster. Writers wrote longer. Songs were sung with a desperation that carried beyond thin walls. These were not distractions. They were farewells disguised as persistence. As the ghetto's cultural pulse beat on, fragile and defiant, the next phase waited just beyond the walls. A phase that would not tolerate audiences, that would not allow gatherings, that would not need to silence culture, because it would remove the people who carried it. The hum continued for now, but it trembled, and those listening closely could hear something else approaching, heavy and final, moving steadily closer with each passing day. Chapter 11. Rumors, Fear, and the First Deportations. At first, it was only a word whispered too quietly to trust. A rumor carried through stairwells and courtyards, passed from mouth to ear with the caution of something dangerous. People leaned close, lowered their voices, glanced toward doors before speaking. Something was happening beyond the walls. Something worse than hunger. Worse than disease, and it was moving closer. No one knew exactly when the rumors began, because they did not arrive all at once. They seeped in slowly, fragmented, contradictory. Stories of transports from other towns, of people taken away and never heard from again, of trains that left full and returned empty. Some dismissed these stories as exaggerations, the product of fear and starvation. Others felt a cold certainty settle in their chests. Hunger had taught them this much. When suffering deepened without explanation, it was rarely accidental. Official announcements offered reassurance. Posters appeared claiming relocations were temporary, that people were being moved east for work, that families would be reunited. The language was smooth, bureaucratic, carefully chosen to sound reasonable. Many wanted to believe it. Belief was easier than confronting the alternative. After years of deprivation, even a lie could feel like relief. But the behavior of the authorities told a different story. Guards became more numerous. Patrols tightened. Lists were compiled obsessively. Names were checked and rechecked. People were ordered to report for registration, then told to wait. Days passed. Weeks. The waiting itself became torture, stretching nerves already frayed by hunger. Inside the ghetto, Anxiety replaced hunger as the dominant sensation. People still starved, still weakened, but fear now sat heavier in the stomach than emptiness. Conversations shifted. Food was no longer the only topic. People asked who had heard what, who knew someone in another ghetto, who had contacts beyond the walls. Information became currency, traded carefully, hoarded, doubted. Families debated endlessly. Should they comply if ordered to move? Should they hide? Should they try to bribe officials? Should they attempt escape? Every option carried risk. Compliance might mean disappearance. Resistance might mean immediate death. There was no safe choice, only degrees of danger. Children sensed the change immediately. Adults spoke in half sentences. Arguments ended abruptly when children entered rooms. Faces tightened when footsteps echoed outside. Children asked questions and received vague answers. They watched bags being packed, then unpacked, then packed again. They learned that something irreversible was approaching. The first deportations did not arrive with chaos. They arrived with procedure. Orders were posted instructing people to assemble at specific locations on specific days. People were told to bring identification, work papers, essential belongings. The tone suggested organization, not violence. Some believed that cooperation might improve outcomes, that work assignments might bring better food, better conditions. Hunger made hope desperate. On the morning of the first assembly, streets filled early. People gathered carrying bundles, dragging carts, holding children by the hand. There was tension, but also confusion. Some dressed carefully, as if appearance might matter. Others brought food, unsure how long they would be gone. The air buzzed with whispers and instructions shouted by officials trying to impose order. Then the violence surfaced. Those who hesitated were beaten. Those who questioned orders were dragged out of line. Shots rang out suddenly, without warning, cutting through the crowd like punctuation marks. Panic surged. Children screamed. Parents clutched them tighter, trying to shield them with bodies already weakened by hunger. The assembly points became places of terror. People were sorted quickly, efficiently. Workers to one side, the elderly to another. Children pulled from parents' hands. Protests were answered with blows. The process was mechanical, practiced, chilling in its speed. Trucks arrived. So did trains. Cattle cars stood waiting, doors open, dark inside. People were pushed forward, packed tightly, forced inside until there was no room to sit or lie down. The smell inside was immediate and overwhelming. Sweat, fear, waste. The doors slammed shut. Bolts slid into place. From outside, the cars looked quiet. From inside, they were alive with sobbing, praying, gasping for air. The trains began to move. Inside the ghetto, those left behind stood frozen. They watched dust settle where crowds had been. They stared at empty streets, abandoned belongings scattered on the ground. Shoes, hats, children's toys. Evidence that entire lives had been lifted away in a matter of hours. No one knew where the trains went. Official explanations continued to insist on relocation and labor. But no letters arrived. No messages came back. Entire families vanished without trace. The absence spoke louder than any rumor. Fear metastasized. People stopped sleeping. Every knock on the door sent hearts racing. Every footstep in the hall sounded like an arrest. Families slept dressed, ready to move at a moment's notice. Bags remained packed, then unpacked, then packed again. This ritual became a way to cope, a way to feel prepared in a situation that allowed no preparation. Some tried to hide. They sealed themselves into attics, cellars, false walls. They crawled into spaces barely large enough to breathe. Food was stockpiled when possible, though never enough. Silence became a survival skill. Coughs were stifled. Children were taught not to cry. Hours stretched into days. Days into weeks. Others volunteered. They reported early, hoping compliance would spare them worse treatment. Some believed their work status would protect them. Some believed separating temporarily might save children. These beliefs were not foolish. They were human. They were shaped by a lifetime of navigating oppression through compromise. Inside the ghetto administration, panic spread. Committees were ordered to produce lists. Names, addresses, numbers. Refusal meant immediate punishment. Compliance meant participation in destruction. Members debated desperately, some resigning, some collapsing under pressure. There was no escape from complicity. The machinery demanded cooperation or blood. Hunger intensified during deportations. Soup kitchens lost volunteers who were taken. Smuggling routes collapsed as patrols increased. Fear kept people indoors. Food supplies dwindled further. Those hiding could not access kitchens at all. Starvation accelerated, squeezing those who remained. Children were especially vulnerable. Many were taken outright. Others were hidden by parents who bribed neighbors or sealed them into walls. Some children were sedated to keep them quiet. Others were separated deliberately, handed to strangers, pushed through windows in moments of desperation. Parents made these choices knowing they might never see their children again. The sound of trains became a trigger. Whistles in the distance caused panic. People froze, listening, counting seconds, trying to determine whether the sound was coming closer or fading away. Each whistle carried the weight of unanswered questions. Information from outside the ghetto grew more alarming. Smuggled reports spoke of mass killings, of camps not designed for work, of smoke rising constantly, of people disappearing immediately upon arrival. These reports were fragmented, difficult to believe, almost impossible to process. Many rejected them outright. The truth was too vast, too monstrous. Denial became a survival mechanism. To accept the full reality would paralyze. People needed a function, to decide, to move. Denial allowed action, even if misguided. It allowed hope to persist, thin and fragile. Those who believed the rumors faced unbearable despair. They understood that deportation meant death, that compliance was not safety, that hiding might only delay the inevitable. This knowledge isolated them. They struggled to convince others, often failing. Words felt inadequate against disbelief. Inside the ghetto, the population thinned rapidly. Entire buildings emptied. Familiar faces vanished. The social fabric unraveled. Trust eroded further as fear intensified. Some accused neighbors of betrayal. Others withdrew completely, conserving energy for survival. The streets changed again. They were quieter, emptier. The absence of children was particularly striking. Playful noise vanished. Courtyards fell silent. The ghetto felt older, grayer, closer to death. For those still alive, time became distorted. Days revolved around avoiding lists, dodging patrols, securing hiding places. Hunger remained constant, but fear dominated. People felt trapped between two deaths: starvation if they hid too long, deportation if they emerged. This was the purpose of the terror: to eliminate choice, to force people into impossible decisions, to exhaust resistance without needing constant violence. Hunger had weakened bodies. Disease had thinned numbers. Now fear completed the process. By now, it was clear that the ghettos were no longer meant to contain. They were meant to empty. Each deportation proved it. Each train confirmed it. The logic of starvation revealed its final shape. The ghettos had served their function. Those who remained sensed the countdown. They felt it in the tightening patrols, the shrinking safe spaces, the growing boldness of violence. They felt it in the way guards no longer pretended at order, no longer bothered with explanation. The future had narrowed to a single question: not how to survive hunger, but how to face what came next. Because the deportations were no longer rumors. They were the beginning of the end. And for those still trapped inside the ghettos, the worst was no longer unimaginable. It was already underway. Chapter 12. Liquidation. The word itself sounded clean, almost clinical. Liquidation. It suggested order, closure, and ending handled efficiently. Inside the ghettos, it meant something else entirely. It meant that the waiting was over. The hunger, the disease, the fear, all of it had been preparation. Now the system moved openly, without disguise. The signs appeared before the orders did. Patrols increased again, this time with a different energy. Less shouting, less chaos, more certainty. Trucks arrived and did not leave. Barracks were erected near gates. Searchlights swept across walls at night, turning courtyards into stark stages where there was nowhere to hide. People sensed the shift immediately. The air felt tighter, heavier, as if the ghetto itself was holding its breath. Announcements followed, posted early in the morning when people were weakest. Entire blocks were ordered to assemble. Entire streets were marked. Deadlines were precise, down to the hour. Failure to comply meant death on the spot. The language no longer promised relocation for work. It promised punishment for disobedience. Families reacted in frantic, contradictory ways. Some packed quickly, mechanically, clinging to routine as if routine could protect them. Others refused to move at all, barricading doors, hiding in walls, crawling into attics and cellars already crowded with fear. Arguments erupted between parents and children, between spouses, between neighbors. Every choice felt wrong. Every minute mattered. Hiding places multiplied overnight. False walls were sealed. Floorboards lifted. Closets emptied to make room for bodies curled into impossible shapes. People wedged themselves behind stoves, beneath staircases, inside crawl spaces where air barely reached. Children were wrapped in rags, instructed again and again not to make a sound. Parents pressed hands over mouths when footsteps approached, hearts pounding so loudly it felt impossible that soldiers could not hear them. Searches began systematically, building by building, floor by floor. Doors were kicked in, furniture overturned, walls struck with rifle butts, listening for hollow sounds. Dogs sniffed corners, growling, pulling at leashes. Anyone discovered was dragged out immediately. Resistance was met with bullets. Bodies fell where they stood, left as warnings. The streets filled with noise, shouting in German, screams, gunfire echoing between buildings, the sound of boots running up staircases, glass shattering. The ghetto, already weakened and quiet, erupted into chaos. Smoke drifted from fires set deliberately to flush people out of hiding. For those forced into the open, the process was swift and brutal. They were herded into squares, lines forming under the threat of violence. The sick were beaten for moving too slowly. The elderly were shot where they stood. Children clung to parents until hands were torn apart. The sorting was ruthless. There was no pretense of fairness. Survival depended on chance measured in seconds. Trucks idled nearby. So did trains. The cattle cars returned, doors open, guards positioned with rifles raised. People were pushed forward in waves. Anyone who fell was trampled. Anyone who tried to turn back was shot. The cars filled quickly, far beyond capacity. People were packed until breathing became difficult, until panic turned to suffocation. Inside the cars, the conditions were unbearable almost immediately. No water, no food, no space to sit. Bodies pressed together, sweat soaking clothing, air growing thin. Children cried until they were too weak to make sound. Adults tried to keep them upright, to shield them from crushing weight. Prayers mixed with sobs, then faded as exhaustion took over. Outside, the process continued relentlessly. One transport left, another formed. The rhythm was efficient, practiced. Guards checked lists, crossed off names, moved on. There was no pause for grief, no acknowledgement of humanity. The machinery did not slow. Those still hiding listened. They listened to footsteps overhead, to screams below, to gunshots that echoed and then stopped. Time stretched unbearably. Every noise threatened discovery. Hunger gnawed at already weakened bodies, making silence harder to maintain. Some fainted. Some suffocated. Some chose to emerge rather than die hidden and alone. Parents faced unimaginable decisions. Some killed their own children rather than allow them to be taken. Others tried to push children through windows, over walls, into the hands of strangers who might offer a chance at survival. These moments lasted seconds and left wounds that could never heal. The Judenrate were dismantled. Those who remained were arrested or executed. Their offices were emptied. Records were seized or destroyed. The administrative layer that had managed starvation was no longer needed. The final phase required no intermediaries. As the liquidation progressed, The ghetto physically changed. Buildings burned. Streets filled with debris. Smoke obscured the sky. The smell of fire mixed with the smell of death, heavy and inescapable. Courtyards where children once played became execution sites. The transformation was total. Those who survived initial roundups were hunted. Days turned into weeks of relentless searches. Soldiers returned repeatedly, knowing that hunger and fear would force people out eventually. Hiding places became tombs. Food ran out. Air grew stale. People emerged skeletal, blinking in daylight, barely able to stand. Many were killed immediately upon discovery. Others were loaded onto the last transports. By now, there were no illusions left. People understood that deportation meant death. Resistance flared in isolated moments. A guard stabbed, a weapon stolen, a final act of defiance before bullets ended it. These acts did not stop the process, but they mattered to those who carried them out. The population collapsed rapidly. What had taken months of starvation and disease was finished in days by liquidation. Entire communities vanished. Names that had filled ration lists, school registers, hospital logs disappeared without trace. Silence followed. When the final transport left, the ghetto stood nearly empty. A few hiding survivors remained, emerging cautiously, stunned by the quiet. Streets were littered with belongings, shoes, books, clothing, photographs, mute evidence of lives erased. The walls remained, but they no longer contained a living community. They enclosed absence. Those who survived did not celebrate. They moved through ruins, searching for signs of family, friends, neighbors. They found nothing. The scale of loss was incomprehensible. Hunger had narrowed focus to survival. Now survival felt hollow without anyone to survive with. Outside the ghetto, life continued. Trams ran. Shops opened. Markets bustled. The contrast was obscene. Smoke drifted upward and dispersed into a sky that looked no different than before. The machinery of destruction folded neatly back into bureaucracy. The purpose of the ghettos was complete. They had isolated. They had starved. They had weakened. And finally, they had emptied. For those still alive, a new reality began. Some will be hunted further. Some will be sent to camps. Some would hide until liberation or death. The ghetto, as a place of life under starvation, was gone. What remained were memories etched into bodies and minds. The taste of watery soup, the weight of a ration card, the sound of carts collecting the dead, the feel of walls closing in. These memories would follow survivors forever, shaping how they understood hunger, fear, and humanity. Liquidation was not an ending. It was a transition, a final handoff from slow death to fast. And as the smoke cleared and the walls stood silent, the truth became unavoidable. The starvation had never been meant to be endured. It had been meant to prepare. And now, with the ghettos emptied and the people gone, the system moved on, efficient and unburdened, toward the next stage of destruction. For those who lived through it, the question was no longer how to survive inside the ghetto. The question was whether survival itself was still possible in a world that had revealed what it was willing to do. Chapter 13. Those who remained. When the last transports rolled away and the smoke thinned, it became clear that liquidation did not mean emptiness. It meant concealment. Beneath the ruins, behind walls that had already swallowed so much, people were still breathing. They were the ones who had not boarded trains, not because they were spared, but because they had vanished into the spaces hunger and fear had carved. They emerged cautiously at first, stepping into daylight that felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. The streets were unrecognizable. Buildings stood gutted, blackened by fire. Windows gaped open like wounds. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant hum of a city that had moved on. Those who remained moved slowly, uncertain whether survival itself was permitted. Hiding had changed them. Bodies were skeletal, weakened by weeks or months without adequate food. Muscles had wasted away. Skin clung to bone. Movements were tentative, calculated, as if every step might trigger punishment. Hunger had taught restraint so deeply that even in freedom, Hands shook when reaching for food. The hiding places they left behind were uninhabitable. Cellars where air barely circulated. Attics where heat suffocated. Crawl spaces where people lay, curled for days without moving. Walls had been hollowed out to create narrow chambers, sealed from the inside with furniture and plaster. In these spaces, people learned to breathe quietly, to swallow coughs, to urinate into rags. Survival demanded silence at any cost. Many did not survive hiding. They suffocated. They starved. They went mad in darkness. Their bodies were discovered later, mummified by neglect, hidden where they had believed safety lay. Hunger had already weakened them. Confinement finished the work. Those who lived carried that knowledge with them. They had heard the searches above them, boots striking floors, dogs barking, rifle butts pounding walls inches from their faces. They had felt the vibration of gunfire through brick and wood. They had learned how long a human body could remain motionless before pain became unbearable, before muscles screamed and then went numb. Time lost meaning in hiding. Days were counted by sounds rather than light. Footsteps meant danger. Silence meant waiting. Hunger distorted perception. Hours stretched endlessly. Minutes passed unnoticed. People marked time by thirst, by the need to relieve themselves, by the ache in joints that could not move. When it was over, the realization came slowly. The ghettos were gone. Not transformed. Erased. The community that had once existed, weakened and starved but alive, no longer did. Survivors searched desperately for familiar faces, calling names softly at first, then louder, then not at all. There was no one to answer. The walls still stood in many places, but they no longer served their purpose. They enclosed emptiness. They guarded ruins. The system had no use for them anymore. They were abandoned structures, reminders of a phase completed. Survivors faced immediate dangers. They were hunted. Patrols returned sporadically, checking ruins, shooting anyone discovered. Anti-Semitism beyond the ghetto boundaries remained lethal. Those who ventured out risked betrayal, denunciation, violence. Survival required new disguises, forged papers, false identities. Hunger did not end with liquidation. It simply changed form. Some survivors joined resistance movements. They were drawn by desperation as much as ideology. Hunger had stripped away illusions about safety. Armed struggle offered purpose where none remained. Former smugglers became couriers. Former laborers learned to handle weapons. Youth hardened by starvation adapted quickly to danger. Others focused solely on staying alive. They hid in forests, barns, abandoned buildings. They relied on sympathetic non-Jews when they could, paid with labor, possessions, or silence. Trust was scarce. Betrayal common. Survival depended on reading people instantly, accurately, often fatally. Food remained the central concern. Bodies emerging from starvation could not handle abundance. Sudden access to food caused sickness, sometimes death. Survivors learned to eat slowly, carefully, retraining bodies that had forgotten how to digest properly. Hunger lingered psychologically long after physical deprivation eased. Food was hoarded instinctively, hidden, guarded. The trauma did not wait for peace. Memories intruded constantly. The sound of trains triggered panic. The smell of smoke caused nausea. Silence felt dangerous. Survivors slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise, hearts racing. Hunger had trained their nervous systems to remain permanently alert. Children who survived were no longer children. They had learned to lie convincingly, to move silently, to read danger in posture and tone. These skills kept them alive, but they also stole something irreversible. Innocence did not return when food did. Childhood did not resume. Some survivors returned to ghetto ruins, searching for documentation. Diaries buried beneath floors. Lists hidden in walls. Notes sealed in jars. These materials mattered. They proved that the ghettos had been communities, not abstractions. That starvation had been deliberate. That people had lived, thought, created, resisted. Retrieving these records was dangerous. Ruins were monitored. Possession of such documents was incriminating. And yet, People risked everything to preserve them. Memory became a form of resistance, now that bodies could not be. As the war progressed, ghettos elsewhere followed the same pattern. Isolation, starvation, disease, deportation, liquidation. Survivors learned that what they had endured was not unique. It was systematic. The realization brought little comfort, but it added clarity. The suffering had been engineered. For many, liberation did not mean relief. When armies advanced and camps were freed, survivors emerged into a world that struggled to understand them. Bodies shocked by sudden nourishment collapsed. Minds fractured under the weight of what had been endured. Hunger left marks deeper than scars. The world outside asked questions survivors could barely answer. How did you live? How did you survive? What did you eat? These questions reopened wounds. They forced recollection of moments better left buried. Survivors learned to compress stories, to summarize horror into manageable phrases. Starvation resisted neat explanation. Returning home was often impossible. Homes were occupied, belongings stolen, neighbors hostile. The social networks that had once sustained life were gone. Survivors drifted, displaced in every sense. Hunger had emptied them. Loss had unmoored them. Some found new communities among other survivors. They shared unspoken understanding. They recognized hunger's shadow in each other's movements, in the way food was handled, in the way silence was tolerated. These bonds offered partial healing. Shared trauma became shared language. Others remained isolated. They carried memories alone, reluctant to burden others or relive pain. Many never spoke fully about what they endured. Hunger had taught them endurance, not expression. The ghettos themselves faded from physical existence. Walls were dismantled, streets rebuilt, buildings repurposed. Cities absorbed the scars unevenly, often without acknowledgement. The sites of starvation became ordinary places again, layered over with new life that rarely paused to remember what had been consumed there. But hunger did not vanish with the walls. It lingered in bodies that never fully recovered, in habits passed to children born after the war, in fear of scarcity that persisted even in abundance. Starvation rewired lives permanently. For historians, doctors, and psychologists, the ghettos became case studies. They examined records kept by starving physicians. They studied the effects of prolonged calorie deprivation. They analyzed the psychological impact of hunger enforced as policy. The findings were clear. What happened was not accidental. It was one of the most comprehensive experiments in controlled starvation ever conducted. For survivors, this knowledge was secondary. What mattered was that hunger had been used as a weapon, that food, dignity, normalcy had been stripped away deliberately, that starvation had paved the way for mass murder by weakening bodies and spirits alike. Memory became the final battleground. Some denied what had happened. Others minimized it. Survivors fought against forgetting, speaking when they could, writing when they could not speak. They described soup that was mostly water, rations that mocked survival, children who aged before their parents' eyes. Each testimony carried the same message. Starvation was not a backdrop. It was the strategy. As years passed, those who had survived hunger watched the world grapple with its implications. Monuments were built, museums established, numbers calculated, and yet the experience of living on 300 calories a day resisted abstraction. It was lived in the body, in the constant ache, in the decisions that haunted sleep. Those who remained were witnesses not only to death, but to endurance. They had seen humanity stripped to its core and still found moments of compassion, creativity, resistance. Hunger had not erased everything. It had revealed both cruelty and courage with brutal clarity. Their survival did not offer closure. It posed a challenge: to remember that genocide does not begin with killing alone. It begins with isolation, with deprivation, with policies that turn food into leverage and hunger into discipline. The ghettos had shown this with horrifying precision. And for those who lived through them, the responsibility to remember did not end when the walls fell. It became heavier, because memory, like hunger, does not fade easily. It waits. and it demands to be fed with truth. Chapter 14. After the Hunger. Hunger did not end when the ghettos disappeared. It loosened its grip slowly, unevenly, leaving behind a body and a mind that no longer remembered how normal life worked. For those who survived, liberation did not arrive as relief so much as shock. The walls fell, the guards vanished, the guns went silent, and yet the body still expected punishment. The stomach still clenched. The mind still rationed hope. The first encounters with food after starvation were dangerous. People who had lived for months or years on a few hundred calories a day could not simply eat again. The body, hollowed and altered, responded violently to abundance. Some survivors collapsed after their first full meals. Others died from heart failure or metabolic shock. Doctors learned quickly that feeding had to be slow, cautious, deliberate. Hunger had changed physiology itself. Even when food was available, fear lingered. Survivors hid bread under pillows. They stuffed pockets with crumbs. They ate quickly, standing, guarding their plates with their arms. Many could not leave food uneaten, even when full. Plates were scraped clean compulsively. Waste felt dangerous. Hunger had trained the body to distrust plenty. Sleep brought no peace. Nightmares replayed searches, trains, hunger pains so vivid they woke survivors gasping. The body remembered starvation more clearly than the calendar remembered dates. Silence felt threatening. Sudden noises triggered panic. Even in safety, the nervous system stayed locked in survival mode. For children who survived, the transition was especially disorienting. They were told they were safe now, but safety was an unfamiliar concept. They had grown up measuring life in risks, calories, hiding places. School felt unreal. Play felt pointless or frightening. Many hoarded food instinctively, hiding it even when meals were regular. Adults scolded them gently, not understanding that hunger had rewritten instinct. Parents struggled to reclaim authority. During starvation, roles had reversed. Children had smuggled food, negotiated danger, made decisions adults could not. Afterward, returning to traditional family structures felt awkward, sometimes impossible. Guilt complicated everything. Guilt over choices made, over children lost, over survival itself. Survivors' guilt became a constant companion. Why did I live when others did not? Why did my child survive while my neighbor's child starved? Why did I receive that extra potato, that moment of luck? Hunger had taught people to calculate relentlessly. Now the calculations turned inward, cruel and unanswerable. The world outside the ghettos struggled to understand. People asked what it had been like, often expecting stories of violence, of sudden death. Survivors spoke instead about hunger, about soups so thin it barely counted as food, about days spent thinking only of bread. Listeners sometimes grew uncomfortable. Hunger sounded mundane, too ordinary, too difficult to reconcile with the scale of the crime. But hunger had been the foundation. It was starvation that weakened bodies until resistance became impossible. Starvation that made disease lethal. Starvation that turned children into smugglers and parents into strategists of crumbs. Survivors understood this with clarity sharpened by experience. Medical studies followed. Doctors examined the long-term effects of prolonged starvation. They documented heart damage, digestive disorders, bone weakness, hormonal disruption. Many survivors never fully recovered physically. Chronic illness followed them for life. Hunger left fingerprints on every system of the body. Psychologists observed deeper wounds. Food anxiety persisted decades later. Depression and anxiety were common. Trust was fragile. Many survivors avoided thinking about the future, living instead in cautious increments. Planning felt dangerous. Hope felt irresponsible. Hunger had taught them that stability was an illusion. Communities of survivors formed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by gravity. They recognized one another immediately, in the way food was handled, in the way silence was tolerated, in the way laughter came cautiously, as if testing whether it was still allowed. Among survivors, explanations were unnecessary. Hunger was a shared language. Many chose to leave Europe entirely. The cities that had starved them fell haunted. Streets rebuilt over ghetto ruins offered no comfort. Emigration promised distance, a chance to start again where hunger was not embedded in every corner. New countries offered food, safety, opportunity, and unfamiliar loneliness. Starting over was not simple. Survivors arrived with little money, few possessions, and bodies still recovering. They worked tirelessly, driven by fear of scarcity. Many became obsessive providers, determined that their children would never know hunger. Food became love expressed through excess. Plates were piled high. Pantries stayed full. This abundance carried its own shadows. Children raised by survivors grew up hearing stories, sensing anxiety, absorbing fear secondhand. Food was never just food. It was security. It was memory. It was proof that catastrophe could be held at bay, at least temporarily. Public memory developed slowly. For years after the war, hunger inside the ghettos received little attention. The focus rested on camps, on gas chambers, on numbers too vast to comprehend. Starvation seemed secondary, almost incidental. Survivors knew better. They waited. When historians returned to ghetto records, the truth emerged with chilling clarity. Ration tables, medical reports, diaries detailing daily calorie counts, evidence that starvation had been policy, not accident. The ghettos were revealed as laboratories of deprivation, places where food was weaponized with bureaucratic precision. This recognition mattered deeply to survivors. It validated what their bodies had always known, that their suffering was not random, that hunger was intentional, that survival under such conditions was not weakness, but endurance against design. Museums and memorials began to include hunger explicitly. Exhibits displayed ration cards, soup ladles, smuggling routes. Visitors read about 300 calories a day and struggled to imagine it. Survivors watched these reactions carefully, measuring whether understanding truly landed. Some survivors spoke publicly. They described hunger in plain terms. The dizziness, the obsession with food, the way it narrowed life to its barest edges. They resisted sensationalism, insisting on specificity. Starvation, they explained, was slow, humiliating, relentless. It killed dignity long before it killed bodies. Others remained silent. They carried hunger privately, unwilling to reopen wounds or to explain what words could not fully convey. Silence became another survival strategy, one that lasted a lifetime. The legacy of hunger extended beyond individuals. It reshaped ethics, law, and international understanding of genocide. The recognition that deprivation could be as lethal as violence influenced future definitions of crimes against humanity. Hunger was no longer seen as collateral damage. It was acknowledged as intent. Yet the danger persisted. Even as the history became clearer, the mechanisms remained relevant. Isolation, dehumanization, control of resources. Survivors recognized these patterns instantly when they appeared elsewhere in the world. Hunger had trained them to see early warning signs others missed. For them, memory was not abstract. It lived in the body's reaction to empty shelves, in the panic triggered by delayed meals, in the way a missed lunch could still feel catastrophic decades later. Hunger was not a chapter that ended. It was a condition carried forward. Commemoration became a responsibility. Survivors insisted that the ghettos be remembered not only as holding areas before camps, but as killing grounds in their own right. Places where hundreds of thousands died without gas chambers, without executions, simply by design. Education followed slowly. Textbooks expanded. Curricula changed. Students learned that genocide does not begin with mass murder. It begins with policies that isolate, deprive, and normalize suffering. Hunger was central to this process. As survivors aged, urgency grew. They spoke knowing time was limited. They recorded testimonies. They donated diaries. They told their children and grandchildren stories they had once avoided. Hunger demanded remembrance before it faded into abstraction. The ghettos themselves continued to change. Urban development erased physical traces. New buildings rose where walls once stood. Streets were renamed. Without deliberate effort, memory threatened to dissolve into normalcy. Survivors pushed back against this erasure fiercely. Plaques were installed. Walking tours created. Ceremonies held. These acts did not restore what was lost. They acknowledged it. They insisted that the hunger endured there mattered, that it was not an unfortunate detail, but a core crime. For survivors, acknowledgement brought complicated relief. Validation eased isolation, but reopened grief. Memory was both burden and duty. Hunger had taken years from their lives. Remembering demanded more. As decades passed, survivors watched a new generation learn about the ghettos. They listened to students ask how anyone could survive on 300 calories a day. Survivors answered carefully. Survival, they explained, was not strength alone. It was luck. It was smuggling. It was sacrifice. It was people helping one another under impossible conditions. They emphasized one truth above all. Starvation was not natural. It was chosen, enforced, calculated. This distinction mattered deeply because it reframed the narrative from tragedy to crime, from inevitability to responsibility, from history to warning. The hunger of the ghettos belonged to the past, but its lessons did not. Survivors knew this instinctively. They had lived inside a system where food became leverage, where deprivation became discipline, where dignity was stripped 1 calorie at a time. As they aged, many spoke less about death and more about hunger. Death ended suffering. Hunger prolonged it. Hunger invaded every thought, every relationship, every decision. Hunger was the daily reality that shaped everything else. This was the truth they wanted preserved. Not only that people died, but how they were forced to live before they died, and how those who lived carried that hunger forward, shaping families, communities, and memory itself. The ghettos were gone, but the hunger they engineered did not vanish with them. It lived on in bodies, in habits, in fear, in vigilance, in the determination that such a weapon should never be allowed to function again without being named for what it is. A deliberate act of destruction, and a warning written not in numbers, but in human lives. Chapter 15. The meaning of 300 calories. 300 calories a day does not sound like much on paper. It fits neatly into a column, a statistic easy to overlook beside larger numbers of deaths and dates. But for those who lived inside the ghettos, 300 calories was not an abstraction. It was the rhythm of existence. It was the boundary between standing and collapsing, between thought and confusion, between hope and resignation. It was the measure by which life was slowly, deliberately taken. To understand what happened in the ghettos, one must return to the body. The body remembers starvation long after the mind tries to forget. Survivors spoke of how hunger hollowed them out, not only physically, but emotionally, how it narrowed the world until nothing existed beyond the next bite, the next sip of watery soup. Hunger was not dramatic. It was relentless. It did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived every morning, unchanged, waiting patiently to finish its work. 300 calories forced the body into constant deficit. The heart weakened. Muscles dissolved. The immune system collapsed. Children stopped growing. Adults aged rapidly. The body adapted only enough to survive a little longer, burning itself slowly to stay alive. Every movement became costly. Every decision required calculation. Life became a math problem with no solution. And yet, within that deprivation, people lived. They loved. They argued. They taught. They sang. They shared crumbs and stories and moments of courage, so small they rarely appear in history books. Hunger did not erase humanity. It tested it continuously, forcing it to surface in fragments, in fleeting acts that mattered precisely because they cost so much. This is what makes the ghettos so difficult to understand from a distance. They were not places of immediate death. They were places of prolonged destruction. Places where killing was outsourced to time, biology, and bureaucracy. Places where food became policy and starvation became strategy. Places where death came not in one moment, but in thousands of quiet ones. The German authorities understood this with chilling clarity. They did not need to shoot everyone. They did not need to gas everyone. Hunger would do the work more efficiently. It weakened resistance. It spread disease. It eroded dignity. It turned survival into competition. It prepared bodies and minds for the final stage. 300 calories was not accidental. It was calculated. It was tested. It was enforced. It reflected an understanding of the human body precise enough to be lethal. The ghettos were not chaotic holding areas. They were systems, closed environments where variables could be controlled and outcomes predicted. The outcome was devastation. Hundreds of thousands died in the ghettos before deportations ever began. They died of starvation, of diseases made fatal by starvation, of exhaustion, of despair. Their deaths were recorded clinically, if at all. They were buried quickly or not at all. Their absence became normalized. This normalization is one of the most dangerous legacies of the ghettos. When hunger becomes routine, when death becomes background noise, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. People step over bodies. They stop asking questions. They focus on survival. This is not moral failure. It is human adaptation under extreme conditions. And it is precisely what systems of oppression rely upon. The ghettos teach this lesson brutally. Genocide does not require immediate mass killing. It requires isolation. It requires deprivation. It requires time. Hunger provides all three. It isolates people inside their own bodies. It deprives them of strength and clarity. It buys time for indifference to grow. The outside world largely failed to see this. Beyond the walls, cities functioned. Food was available. Markets operated. People lived ordinary lives within sight of extraordinary suffering. This proximity did not guarantee awareness. Hunger was contained. That containment was part of its power. After the war, the narrative struggled to include starvation. Gas chambers shocked the world. Starvation seemed less dramatic, harder to visualize, easier to misunderstand. And yet, survivors knew that hunger had been the first weapon used against them, and the one that shaped everything that followed. 300 calories stripped away illusion. It revealed how quickly civilization could unravel when basic needs were controlled by power. It showed how ethics bend under deprivation. It exposed how easily human beings can be reduced to biological problems to be managed rather than lives to be protected. For survivors, this understanding never faded. They carried hunger forward into peace, into families, into work, into old age. Food was never neutral again. It was safety. It was memory. It was fear and comfort intertwined. Many survivors built lives defined by preparation, by vigilance against scarcity, by an unshakable awareness of how fragile stability truly is. Their children inherited this legacy. Not the hunger itself, but its echo, anxiety around food, the need to finish every meal, the impulse to store, to save, to prepare for loss even when none was visible. Trauma did not end with liberation. It changed form. The ghettos also left a legacy for the world. They forced a reckoning with the idea that policy can kill as effectively as violence, that bureaucracy can be weaponized, that spreadsheets and ration cards can do the work of bullets. This understanding reshaped international law, humanitarian principles, and definitions of genocide. But understanding does not guarantee prevention. The mechanisms that made the ghettos possible still exist. Isolation, dehumanization, control of resources, language that disguises cruelty as necessity. Survivors recognized these patterns instantly when they appeared elsewhere, long before others did. This is why memory matters, not as ritual alone, but as warning. The story of the ghettos is not only about Jewish suffering under Nazi occupation. It is about what happens when hunger is used deliberately to control, weaken, and destroy a population. It is about how ordinary structures can be turned lethal without ever appearing violent. 300 calories is a warning written in flesh. It reminds us that genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with deciding who deserves to eat, with deciding how much is enough. with deciding that some lives can be reduced gradually rather than ended quickly. The people who lived and died in the ghettos were not passive victims. They resisted in ways that history often overlooks. By sharing food, by smuggling, by teaching, by documenting, by choosing dignity when dignity cost everything. Their resistance did not stop the system, but it exposed its brutality and preserved truth. This truth survived because they insisted it must. Diaries buried under floors, medical records smuggled out, poems memorized, songs whispered. These fragments outlived the walls and the policies that created them. They stand now as evidence that starvation was not incidental. It was central. To remember the ghettos honestly is to remember hunger, not as background suffering, but as the main instrument of destruction, not as inevitability, but as choice, not as tragedy alone, but as crime. 300 calories a day was enough to keep people alive just long enough to suffer fully. That was the point. The final lesson of the ghettos is not only about the past. It is about vigilance, about recognizing early signs of dehumanization, about refusing language that turns people into burdens, mouths, numbers, about understanding that access to food is not merely a humanitarian issue, but a moral one. Because once hunger becomes policy, the path forward is already set. The walls may look different, the language may change, but the outcome follows the same logic. The ghettos show us where that logic leads. And the memory of those who lived on 300 calories a day demands that we never look away when hunger is used as a tool of power again. Not anywhere. Not ever.